Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I still think about that night in 2011 more often than I'd like to admit. I remember every little thing about it. The way the snow came down in thick, heavy flakes, almost like little wet clumps that stuck to the windshield wipers no matter how fast they moved back and forth. The way the heater in my old Honda Civic blew out hot air that smelled faintly of antifreeze and stale coffee from the thermos I'd knocked over on the passenger side a few days earlier. The way my girlfriend sat quietly next to me, scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving in small circles as she read random posts to keep herself awake. We had left her parents' house just after dinner. Her mom made beef stew and fresh biscuits that steamed when we tore them apart. It was still early winter, so the snowstorm wasn't a surprise, but it had picked up fast that evening. Her parents offered for us to stay the night, but I was stubborn back then, always thinking I could handle anything, any weather, any road. I just wanted to get home and sleep in my own bed. I told them the highway was straight and quiet, nothing to worry about. The drive was long and silent, just the hum of the tires against thin snow on asphalt, the occasional rattle of slush hitting the underside of the car. The highway itself was old. It used to be the main route between our town and the next one over, but ever since they built the new bypass, hardly anyone used it except locals who wanted to avoid the tolls or truckers cutting through for convenience. It was one of those roads with cracked shoulders and fading lines down the center, lined by dense pine forest on either side. In daylight it looked peaceful, even pretty in fall, but at night it felt like an abandoned path into nowhere. We had been behind this dark blue SUV for at least 30 minutes. It was comforting to see their taillights glowing red through the snowfall, like two small beacons, showing me where the curves were coming up ahead. They kept a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow, and I kept my distance so the snow they kicked up didn't blind me. My girlfriend dozed off after a while, her head resting against the cold window, her breath fogging up the glass with each exhale. I don't know how long we drove like that, but at some point I noticed the SUV was slowing down. Their brake lights glowed brighter, and then they came to a full stop right in the middle of the lane. At first I thought maybe there was a fallen tree branch or an animal on the road, so I slowed down too and stopped about 20 feet behind them. I remember tapping the steering wheel with my gloved fingers, feeling that small sense of impatience, wanting to get home and crawl under a blanket. When they didn't move after half a minute, I flicked my blinker on and maneuvered around them carefully, pulling into the other lane so I could see what they were stopped for. That's when I saw it, a truck sitting diagonally across the road. It was an old Chevy pickup, dark green with a rusted wheel well on the rear driver's side. Both the driver and passenger doors were wide open, snow falling onto the worn cloth seats. The dome light was on, glowing dim yellow through the thick flakes falling between us. The headlights were still shining ahead, illuminating nothing but swirling snow and the shadow of trees lining the highway on both sides. The truck sat silent and still, engine running, exhaust rising into the cold air like a slow ghost. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder and put my hazards on. My girlfriend stirred awake, rubbing her eyes and asking what was happening, but I didn't say anything. I was too focused on the truck, trying to make sense of it. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out into the snow was how quiet everything felt. The kind of silence you only hear in heavy snowstorms, when sound gets swallowed up by the falling flakes, and there's just the soft hiss of snow hitting the ground. The cold bit through my jeans almost instantly, numbing my knees as I walked toward the truck. I didn't see any damage. No flat tires, no smashed fenders, no skid marks leading up to it. I thought maybe it had broken down, and the driver had walked off to get help. But why would both doors be open like that? I got closer and looked inside. There was nothing unusual, just some fast food wrappers in the cup holders, an empty Gatorade bottle on the passenger seat floor, a couple of grocery bags in the back seat, filled with canned soup and paper towels. What really got me, though, was the tracks in the snow. 2 sets of footprints leading away from the truck and straight into the woods. They were fresh, edges still crisp and clean, not yet softened or filled in by falling snow. The footprints were side by side, not staggered, almost like the 2 people had been walking calmly, not running. I stood there staring at them, feeling the hairs rise up on the back of my neck. The forest was pitch black beyond the first few tree trunks. I couldn't see where the tracks ended. They just disappeared into darkness. The SUV driver rolled down his window and called out to me, but I didn't hear what he said the first time. I was too focused on the footprints, on the way they just went straight in without pause. He called out again louder, and I turned back toward his car. He gestured for me to come over, so I trudged back through the snow, boots crunching and squeaking with each step. He told me that the truck had been reported stolen earlier that day. Apparently he had a police scanner in his car and heard it while driving. He said highway patrol was already on their way, so there wasn't much point in poking around. I remember nodding, feeling a sense of relief mixed with unease. Relief because it gave me a reason not to follow those tracks, but unease because of how unnatural the scene felt. Two people walking calmly into the woods during a snowstorm with no coats visible in the cab. The truck left idling in the middle of the highway. It didn't sit right with me. I got back into my car, shaking the snow off my shoulders before climbing in. My girlfriend asked what happened, and I told her someone had probably abandoned their truck. She looked out the window at the SUV ahead, then at the truck, her brow furrowed, but she didn't say anything else. I pulled back onto the road and drove around the SUV and the truck, giving them both a wide berth. In my rearview mirror, I saw the SUV driver get out and stand by his door, watching me leave. His brake lights and hazards blinked against the swirling snow until they disappeared behind a curve. The rest of the drive home felt tense. Every mile felt longer than it should have. I kept thinking about those footprints and the dark line of trees they vanished into. I imagined someone standing in there, just inside the tree line, watching me from the shadows as I drove away. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see another truck or someone standing in the middle of the road. But there was nothing. Just black highway, white snow, and the thin yellow glow of my headlights cutting through the storm. When we finally got home, I was exhausted. My legs were still cold from standing in the snow, and my hands felt stiff even though the car heater was on full blast. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those two sets of footprints going side by side into the trees. I saw the open doors of the truck, snow piling up slowly on the seats. I heard the silence of the storm, that deep hush that made the whole world feel empty. The next day I went to work as usual. I didn't really tell anyone about what happened. It felt too strange to explain. Around lunchtime, I checked the local news on my phone and saw the article. They found the owner of the truck. He was a man in his late 50s, lived about 5 miles from where his truck was abandoned. His wife had reported him missing over a week earlier. They said his body was found in a ditch about 100 yards into the woods, with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The article didn't say anything else, just that it was being treated as a homicide and that the investigation was ongoing. I sat there at my desk, staring at my phone screen, feeling my stomach twist in on itself. My hands were shaking. I thought about those footprints, how fresh they were, how they walked calmly into the trees like nothing was wrong. Whoever marched him out there must have done it right before we arrived. Maybe they heard us coming and ran off deeper into the woods. Maybe they were still out there, watching us as we pulled up behind the SUV. I didn't hear a gunshot. Neither did the SUV driver. The snow must have muffled it, or maybe it happened just minutes before we got there. I don't know what would have happened if I'd followed those tracks into the forest. I think about it a lot. I think about how I stood there, squinting into the darkness, debating whether to keep going. Part of me wanted to. Part of me felt like it was the right thing to do. What if someone was hurt, cold, or lost? What if someone needed help? But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the SUV driver called me over, or maybe it was the fear that pressed down on my chest the longer I stared at the footprints. Whatever it was, it kept me from taking another step forward. I never heard anything else about the case. It went cold after a while. No suspects, no arrests, no updates. Just another unsolved murder along that forgotten stretch of highway. Every winter when the snow starts falling again, I think about that night. I think about the quiet, about the truck sitting there with its doors hanging open, about the footprints that led into darkness and never came back out. I think about how close I came to following them, and I think about how lucky I am that I didn't. I had been on the trail for 4 days at that point. My legs were used to the rhythm of walking now, the ache settling into a dull, manageable feeling that only flared up when I sat down too long. That evening, I set up camp near a small clearing off the trail. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was flat enough for my small two-person tent, and there was a fallen log nearby that worked perfectly as a kitchen bench. The sun was dropping fast behind the trees, leaving that soft, cold blue light before darkness properly settled in. After pitching my tent and spreading out my sleeping pad and bag, I grabbed my bear canister, stove, and food bag and walked a little away from camp to cook. I had my little routine dialed in: set up the stove, boil water, pour it into the pouch, seal it, shake it around, let it sit. I always use that time to clean up, brush my teeth, and dig a cat hole if needed before bed. That night, nature called stronger than usual, so I carried my trowel, headlamp, and toilet paper roll off into the trees. I took my time, trying to enjoy the last bit of fading light. The forest felt calm. Crickets had started their singing, and there was a light breeze pushing through the higher branches, making that soft whispering sound that always made me feel a little on edge, but comforted at the same time. I kept my headlamp off, saving batteries and letting my eyes adjust to the twilight. When I was done, I buried everything neatly, packed out the paper, and made my way back along the path I'd trampled down through the undergrowth. When I got close to camp, I noticed something was off. The quiet felt different. Usually, I'd hear the faint clicking of my cooling stove or the wind rattling the tent fabric, but there was only silence. I stopped behind a tree before stepping fully back into the clearing. That's when I saw him. There was a man crouched at the front of my tent. He had unzipped the vestibule and was reaching inside, shifting things around. My pack lay open on its side near him. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, and from where I stood about 30 feet away, I could only see his side profile in the dim light. His movements were quick and quiet, like he was searching for something specific. Every few seconds, he'd pause and look up, scanning the trees around him. My heart was hammering so hard I felt like it was going to shake the leaves above me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. I just stood there, watching him. The sky was getting darker by the minute, that short window between twilight and black night closing in. I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple, even though the air was getting cold. He rummaged for what felt like forever. I saw him pull out my sleeping bag, shake it once, and then stuff it back inside. He unrolled my rain jacket, checked the pockets, and threw it aside. He opened my food bag and closed it again. I could see him tilt his head a little as he listened to the forest sounds, like he was trying to hear if someone was coming. Then, just as quietly as he'd arrived, he zipped everything up, stood up slowly, turned, and walked off into the trees in the opposite direction from where I was standing. He moved fast, no hesitation, like he knew exactly where he was going. He didn't take anything. He didn't even look back. I waited there behind the tree, gripping my trowel in my hand like it was a weapon. My chest hurt from holding my breath, and my knees were shaking so bad I had to lean against the trunk to stay upright. I watched the spot where he disappeared until the light was almost completely gone. The forest was still silent, except for the sound of my pulse pounding in my ears. When I finally stepped back into the clearing, I moved slowly, scanning every shadow. My stove sat on the log where I left it, my pot empty and cold. I walked over to the tent and checked everything he'd touched. My sleeping bag was still there, stuffed messily into its sack. My jacket was crumpled on the ground where he threw it. My food bag was zipped shut, and nothing seemed missing. I checked my pack, all the pouches and zippers. My knife was still in the hip belt pocket, my headlamp in the top lid, my extra batteries in the mesh pouch. My bear canister was sitting under the log, unopened. I couldn't think clearly. My body was in that shaky, numb state like I'd just sprinted for miles. I looked around at the trees, at the fading trail, at the darkening sky above, and I just knew I couldn't stay there. There was no way I could sleep knowing that man was somewhere out in the forest. He hadn't taken anything, and that was what scared me the most. If he'd been a normal thief, he would have grabbed the food or my phone battery pack and run. But he searched through my gear and left without a sound. I packed up in a frenzy. I shoved my sleeping bag into its stuffed sack without rolling it. I didn't care about folding my tent poles neatly. I broke camp in record time, grabbing everything and stuffing it wherever it fit in my pack. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped my stove twice onto the dirt. I clipped my bear canister onto the outside of my pack, even though I never carried it that way. I just needed to get moving. By the time I was ready, full darkness had settled over the woods. I strapped on my headlamp, flicked it to high, and started walking back towards the trail. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder into the shadows. I kept imagining I'd see him standing there, just watching me. My breathing was ragged, like I'd been running even though I was only hiking. I tripped over roots and rocks because I was too busy scanning the trees to watch the trail. The forest felt different at night. Every sound felt louder, closer. Branches cracking in the distance made me jump out of my skin. The beam of my headlamp swung wildly with every movement of my head, throwing long shadows that danced and twitched like animals stalking through the undergrowth. My stomach was tight with fear, and I felt like I was going to throw up, but I kept moving. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I needed to get away. Away from that camp, away from that man, away from whatever he wanted. I thought about stopping to set up camp again somewhere further down the trail, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Every rustle of leaves or twig snapping would feel like him coming back. I decided I'd hike until dawn if I had to, just to put distance between us. Hours passed like that. I walked with my headlamp on high until the battery started to fade. Then I switched to medium, worried I'd run out before morning. My feet hurt worse than they ever had. My shoulders burned from the weight of my pack. The straps dug into my collarbones and rubbed my hips raw, but I didn't care. I just kept walking. At one point, I stopped to drink some water. My hands were so unsteady I spilled half of it down my front. The cold soaked through my shirt, making my chest feel icy in the night air. I stuffed the bottle back in the side pocket and kept moving. Around 3 or 4 in the morning, I started to feel lightheaded. My legs were moving on autopilot. I was so tired I felt like I might fall asleep while walking, but I couldn't stop. I kept seeing his face in my mind, even though I'd barely seen it in the dim light. The shape of his hood, the way he crouched over my tent, the quickness of his movements. The image played over and over again until my stomach twisted with fear and nausea. Eventually, I reached a small junction in the trail with a wooden sign marking a side path down to a Forest Service road. I stood there, my headlamp illuminating the faded letters. My brain felt foggy and slow, but I knew that road would eventually lead to a ranger station or some pullout where I could rest safely. I turned down the path and started the long descent. When the first light of dawn started to creep through the trees, I felt a relief so strong I nearly cried. The forest changed from black to dark gray to soft silver. Birds started to wake up, singing quiet morning calls. I turned off my headlamp to save the last bit of battery and walked in the dim light. My knees were stiff, and my back felt broken from the heavy pack and nonstop hiking, but I didn't care. I just kept going. When I reached the gravel forest road, I dropped my pack onto the ground and sat down next to it. The early morning air was cold and damp against my sweaty skin, and the gravel pressed uncomfortably into my legs, but it felt like safety. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath, listening to the wind in the tall pines around me. The sun hadn't fully come up yet, but the sky was turning pale pink and orange behind the treetops. I never saw the man again. I don't know what he was looking for or what he wanted. I don't know if he was dangerous or just curious, but none of that mattered to me. That feeling I had when I saw him rummaging through my gear, the dread that settled into my bones like cold water, told me everything I needed to know. There's nothing good that comes from someone looking through your stuff in the middle of the woods at night. I didn't want to stick around to find out what he really wanted. I got up from the gravel road, slung my pack back over my aching shoulders, and started walking again as the sun finally rose behind me, lighting the trees in warm gold. I knew one thing for sure as I left that part of the forest behind. I'd never camp alone without looking over my shoulder again. I was living in Colombo, Sri Lanka, back in 2019. It was the first time in my life that I had ever lived outside my home country, and honestly, I wasn't even sure what I was doing there. I had been traveling through Asia for months, working online as an editor for small websites, moving from hostel to hostel, country to country. But by the time I reached Colombo, my money had started running low. I needed to stop moving for a bit and just let my finances recover, so I booked a cheap bed in a small hostel on the outskirts of the city and settled in for a while. The hostel itself wasn't bad. It wasn't fancy either, but it felt like a small community. The rooms were hot and muggy, the ceiling fans clattered loudly all night, and mosquitoes always found their way in somehow, no matter how tight I shut the screens. But it was cheap, and after a few weeks there, I got used to the small things that bothered me in the beginning. The walls were painted bright turquoise, and there were large murals of Buddhist art everywhere. The paint was peeling in places, revealing older layers underneath. It always smelled faintly of curry, soap, and rain-soaked cement. Most people there were long-term guests. A few digital nomads like me, a couple from Germany teaching English, 2 Sri Lankan university students doing internships in the city, and then there was Raj. He was one of the first people to introduce himself to me. Medium height, always wearing cargo shorts and thin polo shirts, hair trimmed short on the sides but shaggy on top. His teeth were stained yellow from too many cigarettes and betel nut chews. He had a habit of sitting out on the small balcony late into the night, smoking and scrolling on his phone, whispering rapidly in Tamil or Hindi to whoever was on the other side of his calls. He told me he worked in the casinos. At first, I thought he was a dealer or a server or something like that. But eventually, as he started trusting me more, he explained his job. He called himself a middleman, but the more he explained, the more it sounded risky and dirty. He would take online bets from clients in India and make the bets physically in casinos in Colombo. Basically, he held people's money, placed their bets, collected their winnings or losses, and then sorted out the payments with his clients later. He said it was good money and didn't require much effort as long as he kept his books in order. But every time he talked about it, he would glance around to make sure no one else was listening. His forehead would get sweaty, and his knee would bounce under the table like he was anxious about just saying it out loud. One night, I remember walking past him on the balcony. He was pacing back and forth, phone pressed tight to his ear, his face twisted with stress. His voice was tense and angry. He was speaking Tamil, so I couldn't understand anything, but I could tell from his tone that something was very wrong. After that night, he was different. He stopped sitting on the balcony at night. He barely talked to anyone. His eyes were sunken and dark, like he hadn't slept. I'd see him early in the morning, long before anyone else woke up, sitting on the bottom step of the staircase with his head in his hands, phone lying on the ground beside him. One afternoon, I was cooking some instant noodles in the small kitchen when Raj came in. He looked like he had just been caught in the rain. His shirt was clinging to his back with sweat, hair stuck to his forehead. He walked to the fridge, opened it, stared inside for a few seconds, and then shut it again without taking anything. He turned around, and I saw his eyes were bloodshot. He looked at me like he was seeing through me. Then he walked out of the kitchen without saying a word. That was the last time I saw him. The next morning, his bed was empty. His sheets were still there, crumpled and messy, and his old backpack was shoved under the bunk. On top of his pillow was a piece of paper. Someone found it while cleaning. I heard about it later from one of the Sri Lankan students. Apparently, it said something like, "Don't look for me," and I'm leaving along with some scribbled words in Tamil that no one really understood. At first, we all thought he had run off to escape some debt collectors or angry client. It sounded like something Raj might do, just disappear to some village in the mountains and lay low for a while until things calmed down. But 2 days later, police showed up at the hostel. They came in a small white pickup with rust along the bottom edges. 3 men stepped out, wearing short-sleeved button-down shirts and dark trousers. They walked around asking about Raj. No one wanted to talk. People were afraid. In Sri Lanka, you just didn't get involved in things like this. The casinos were run by powerful people. The police were underpaid and often corrupt. No one wanted their name tangled in whatever Raj had gotten into. But they needed someone to come with them, someone who knew Raj well enough to confirm something. I didn't really know him deeply, but I knew him better than the others, so I agreed. I remember sitting in the back of their pickup as they drove through the crowded streets of Colombo. Motorbikes weaving between cars, fruit sellers shouting from wooden carts on the sidewalk, dogs sleeping curled up on broken pavement. My knees were shaking. I kept my hands clasped together, pressing my fingernails into my palms so hard it hurt. We reached a small building behind the main police headquarters. It looked like a storage unit, metal bars over the windows, paint peeling off in long strips. They led me down a narrow hallway, the smell of bleach and sewage mixing in the hot air. A fluorescent light flickered overhead, buzzing loudly. At the end of the hallway, they stopped in front of a metal door and unlocked it. Inside, the room was small and windowless. A single table sat in the middle, and on top of it was a file folder. One of the officers opened the folder and started flipping through photographs. My eyes blurred for a moment before they focused. The pictures were of a body, or what used to be a body. It was in pieces. I could see an arm with a faded tattoo, part of a chest with hair on it, a severed foot still wearing half a sandal. My stomach lurched, but I swallowed down the bile. The officer flipped to another photo. Ahead, it was Raj's face. His eyes were closed, lips slightly parted like he was asleep, but his neck ended abruptly. The skin around it was ragged and dark with dried blood. I just nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, and my tongue felt heavy. They closed the folder and told me I could go. They didn't say anything else. No thank you, or sorry you had to see that. They just led me back out into the hot sun, blinking against the bright light. I sat in the back of the pickup again on the way back to the hostel. I remember watching people going about their normal day. A woman hanging laundry on a balcony, a child running barefoot down an alley, two old men playing carom under a banyan tree, and thinking how none of them knew that Raj was dead. None of them knew that his body had been cut apart and dumped into the sewer canal by some men who probably wouldn't even face jail for it. When I got back to the hostel, everyone was quiet. They all watched me as I walked to my bunk. I sat down, staring at the floor for a long time. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photos again. His face, his foot still wearing that broken sandal, the piece of his chest with hair on it, like it was nothing but butchered meat. A few days later, I packed my bags and left. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't even tell them where I was going. I just walked out into the sticky morning heat with my backpack, flagged down a tuk-tuk, and asked the driver to take me to the train station. As we pulled away, I looked back at the hostel one last time. The turquoise walls, the flickering fluorescent light on the balcony, the rusted gate that never closed properly. It felt like the place was rotting from the inside out. I didn't want to be there anymore. After I left, I tried not to think about Raj. I tried not to think about his life, or what he did, or who killed him. But sometimes, when I was lying in my bunk in a different hostel in a different country, listening to the sound of distant motorbikes and dogs barking in the dark, I would see his face again in my mind. I would wonder what it felt like for him in those last moments. If he saw them coming, if he knew what they were going to do, if he begged or fought back, or just closed his eyes and waited for it to end. I don't know why I still think about him so often. Maybe because he was just a normal person, a guy who wanted to make money and survive in a city that didn't care about him. Maybe because I keep wondering if I could end up like him one day, alone in a place where no one really knows me, where no one would look for me if I disappeared, where my body could end up in pieces, floating down some sewer canal, and the only person to identify me would be someone I barely even knew. I left Sri Lanka soon after. I went to Thailand, then Vietnam, then Cambodia. But I never forgot what happened there. I never forgot how fragile life felt after that. How fast it could be ripped away. How easily you could disappear without anyone fighting for you. Raj made mistakes, but he didn't deserve to die like that. He didn't deserve to become someone's warning story. But that's what he became in my mind. A reminder that there are things in this world darker than any nightmare I could ever dream. Things that walk around in daylight, sit next to you on the bus, serve you food in restaurants, sleep in the bunk above you. People capable of cutting another human being into pieces and going home to eat dinner with their families like nothing happened. Sometimes late at night, I still see his eyes when I close mine. And in that quiet, when the world feels so still, I think about the last words he wrote on that piece of paper. Don't look for me. I wish I didn't, but I always do. When I was 18, my family decided to go to Hawaii for vacation. My mom was always the type who wanted to see everything and do everything wherever we went. She wasn't the type to sit on a beach with a drink in her hand all day. No, she wanted to hike trails, find hidden waterfalls, eat street food, and go where normal tourists didn't go. On this trip, she really wanted to do the road to Hana. It's a famous route on Maui with tons of stops, waterfalls, small fruit stands, bamboo forests, lookouts over cliffs, and small beaches tucked away from the main roads. Most tourists take a guided tour bus because the road is dangerous, winding, and narrow, and the locals don't really like tourists clogging up their route. But that wasn't good enough for my mom. She wanted to drive it herself, so we could stop wherever we wanted. The rental car company didn't recommend it. In fact, they basically said not to do it at all. The car wasn't insured on that road because of how risky it was. But my mom didn't care. She rented a small silver car, packed us all in, and off we went early that morning. We woke up before sunrise, grabbed hotel breakfast, filled the car with gas, and started the drive while it was still dark. I remember sitting in the back seat, half asleep, watching the sun slowly light up the ocean far below the cliffs as the road climbed higher. The day was actually pretty amazing. We stopped at all sorts of places. We saw a black sand beach with sand so fine it stuck to your feet like powder. We bought fresh pineapple and bananas from a small shack on the side of the road, where a man was slicing them open right in front of you with a machete. We hiked a short trail to a waterfall where locals were jumping off the rocks into the pool below, even though there were signs telling people not to. The forest felt alive and heavy, with the humidity sticking to your skin and every leaf glistening in the sun. Everything smelled rich and earthy. Flowers bloomed along the trail, and bugs buzzed around our faces. At one point, we pulled over just to look out at the ocean, bright blue with waves curling far below the cliff's edge. I sat on a small rock and ate a banana while the wind pushed my hair back, and for a moment, I felt like nothing could touch me. Like I was outside of time, away from school and stress and thinking about college. We spent the entire day stopping, hiking, eating, taking pictures, laughing. But by the time the sun was starting to set, we realized we were nowhere near back to the start of the road. My mom didn't want to drive the winding route all the way back in the dark, so she decided to take a different route that looped around the backside of the island. The problem was that this road wasn't really a road meant for cars like ours. It was mostly dirt, gravel, sometimes paved in parts, but narrow with rough patches and big potholes. The rental car company had told her not to take this road either. But again, she didn't care. As night fell, we found ourselves driving on a road so narrow that you couldn't even open your door fully without hitting the mountain wall on one side or tipping over the edge on the other. There were no guardrails. The headlights of our car lit up the immediate path ahead, but beyond that, it was just blackness. When I looked out the window, I could see the moon reflecting on the water far below. It was a straight drop into darkness and ocean. My stomach felt hollow when I thought about it, so I stopped looking out that side. The only sounds were the engine humming, the tires crunching over gravel, and the soft whoosh of wind hitting the car. My dad was quiet in the passenger seat, staring ahead, probably praying we wouldn't pop a tire or hit a rock wrong and slide off the cliff. My little brother was asleep against the door, drooling on his seatbelt. I just sat there feeling the tension in the car, the type that makes your chest feel tight, like you can't breathe properly. At one point, we reached this bend in the road. It curved in a tight horseshoe around a thick clump of trees. There was a small waterfall spilling down onto the rocks just above us, and mist hung in the air, drifting across the headlights. Beyond the bend was a cliff overhang that blocked out the moonlight in patches. My mom slowed down, then stopped the car at a small flat spot just big enough to fit us off the road slightly. If another car came by, they could pass, but barely. She turned off the car engine and lights, plunging us into darkness. Then she said she wanted to take pictures of the moon, the stars, the ocean below. She was right, the sky was so clear. Millions of stars were scattered across it, and the moon was bright, lighting up the tops of the trees with a silver glow. She got out with her phone. I got out too because I was tired of sitting in the car, and I needed to stretch my legs. The air outside felt damp and cool. It smelled fresh, like wet earth, moss, and salty sea breeze all mixed together. The waterfall trickled nearby, and I could hear small drops hitting rocks below. I walked a few feet away from the car, careful not to go too close to the edge. When I looked down, it was just blackness. I couldn't even see the ocean, but I could hear the faint crash of waves far below. I looked up at the stars and felt so small, like the whole world was pressing down around me, but also so wide and empty at the same time. It was dead silent except for the waterfall and the distant ocean. No cars, no people, no insects even. Just silent, heavy night. Then I heard it. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. A small sound, like a whimper or a sigh carried on the breeze. I turned my head towards the trees but saw nothing. Then it came again, clearer this time. It sounded exactly like a baby crying. A sharp, thin wailing sound, then a pause, then the sound again. I stood there frozen. My heart started beating faster in my chest. It felt wrong, completely out of place. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses, no villages nearby, no parked cars or signs of people for miles back. We hadn't even passed anyone for hours. I felt my skin crawl. The crying kept going, echoing softly through the trees, as if it was just out of sight. I looked at my mom, who was still standing near the car, fiddling with her phone. I waited for her to react, but she didn't. It stopped. The crying just cut off. I felt a small shiver run up my arms. The waterfall trickled steadily. I could hear my mom's phone clicking as she took pictures of the moon. Everything felt still again. I kept staring into the trees, trying to see movement, but it was just shadows shifting as the breeze moved the branches. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to step closer, but also unable to turn away. After a few seconds, it started again. The crying, thin and desperate, echoing from the darkness. It didn't sound muffled like from an animal in the brush. It was clear, high-pitched, human. I felt my chest tighten and my mouth go dry. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I just stood there listening with every nerve in my body pulled tight like a wire. I finally forced myself to step back towards the car. I felt a weird guilt in my stomach, like I was abandoning someone, but my brain kept saying it didn't make sense. A baby couldn't survive out here, alone in the cold. There was no place it could have come from. The crying stopped again. Silence fell so heavily that I felt my ears ringing from the absence of noise. My mom finally looked over at me and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer. I just kept staring at the trees, waiting to hear it again. We stood there for maybe 15 minutes in the dark. The crying didn't come back. Eventually, my mom got back in the car, and I followed her without saying anything. The seat felt cold when I sat down. She started the engine, and the headlights lit up the trees again. Everything looked normal, just leaves, rocks, the curve of the road disappearing into shadows. We drove on slowly, the tires crunching over gravel. No one spoke. My brother was still asleep, breathing softly. My dad just stared ahead with a tired look on his face. I pressed my head against the window and watched the darkness slip by. When we got back to the hotel, it was almost 2 in the morning. I felt sick with exhaustion. My legs hurt from sitting so long, and my head was heavy with all the thoughts I couldn't shake. I showered and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The crying still echoed in my head, like it had imprinted itself deep inside me. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a goat or a deer, but nothing felt right about that explanation. It sounded too human, too desperate. In the morning, I asked my mom if she remembered hearing anything weird the night before. She just shook her head and told me she was too focused on taking her pictures. I left it at that. We spent the rest of the vacation exploring beaches and eating shaved ice and hiking more trails. But every time we drove past a thick forest or saw the moon over the ocean, I felt that hollow feeling in my chest again, remembering the sound that didn't belong to that place or any place. After we flew back home, I never heard about it again. I looked up stories about babies crying on the road to Hannah, thinking maybe there was some explanation, some animal call that sounded like that, but I didn't find anything. Life moved on. School started. I turned 19. But even now, years later, when I hear a baby cry, part of me is pulled back to that narrow road, that waterfall bend, that night sky heavy with stars, and the feeling of standing in the dark, listening to something I couldn't see, knowing I would never be able to forget the sound of it. We left the campground just after sunrise. The sky was clear and bright, without a single cloud to block out the sun. The air was cold and fresh, and each breath felt like it was cleaning out my lungs. My friend walked in front of me, carrying his large pack strapped tightly to his shoulders. Mine was heavy too, stuffed with a sleeping bag, tent, food, and the small bolt-action rifle that we brought for bears. The metal of the rifle was freezing when I picked it up that morning, and I could still feel the chill lingering through the sling on my shoulder. The trail was barely a trail. It was just patches of worn tundra and flattened grass left by moose, or by a few hikers who bothered coming all the way out here. The campground itself had been empty when we arrived the day before. There were picnic tables half buried in grass, rusted fire rings with old ash hardened inside, and a single outhouse that smelled like death itself when the wind blew the wrong way. Other than that, there was nothing but the sound of wind through the low tundra brush and distant cries of birds wheeling in the sky. We headed up toward the first ridge. Every step felt like walking through soaked sponge. The tundra ground was uneven and soft in places, with patches of moss so thick they swallowed your boots. We pushed up the side of the ridge in a slow climb, sweat dripping down my back under my coat, even though the air was cold enough to burn the tips of my ears. We paused at the top to drink water and look back. Behind us, the campground was just a tiny clearing by a bend in the deep river that cut the valley in two. The river looked black from up there, winding between the flat green ground and disappearing far off around a bend. Beyond it was just emptiness. No towns, no roads, just the quiet land and mountains. After the first ridge, we followed a stretch of mountain spine that dropped off into steep rocky cliffs on each side. The wind was strong there, pushing at our packs and making us lean into it to stay balanced. It was hard not to think about what would happen if I slipped. The drop would break a person's legs before they even hit bottom. I kept my eyes on the thin path of moss and rock in front of my boots, moving slowly. We passed loose boulders bigger than cars, scattered on the ridge as if they'd been thrown down by a giant. It was silent except for the wind and the crunch of gravel under our feet. By the time the sun was lowering toward the west, painting all the peaks in gold, we reached the descent into the valley. My knees ached from the climb, and my thighs felt like rubber as we stepped carefully down. The slope wasn't too steep, but the ground was soft and covered in brush that grabbed at my pants. We moved slow, so we didn't twist an ankle. At the bottom, the land flattened into a wide open valley with grass taller than my knees. Small streams wound through it, catching the light and reflecting the sky in long, bright lines. There were clumps of willow bushes here and there, barely taller than a man, and the smell of earth was strong and fresh. We decided to camp there. It was sheltered from the wind by the ridges on either side, and there was a small rise next to a stream that was dry enough for the tent. I dropped my pack with relief. My shoulders burned where the straps dug into my bones. My friend set up the tent while I gathered stones to build a small windbreak for the stove. We boiled water and made instant noodles and tea, sitting with our backs against the packs, eating slowly while the sun set. The sky turned purple and pink before fading to dark blue. As soon as the sun was gone, the temperature dropped fast. Our breath made small white clouds in the glow of our headlamps. I laid out our socks and shirts on the clothes drying rack we'd brought, so they wouldn't stay damp through the night. When we crawled into the tent, it was freezing. I could hear the wind scraping across the top of the tent fabric, making it ripple slightly, but not as hard as on the ridges. I lay there for a while listening to my own breathing and to my friend shifting in his sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable. The rifle was between us, unloaded, but with the ammo close in case a bear came through in the night. I closed my eyes and felt my body sinking into sleep slowly, thoughts drifting from the climb to the cold to the next day's route up to the peak. Then I heard it, a footstep, heavy enough to sink into the moss and grass, but light enough that it wasn't an animal like a bear or moose. Another footstep came after it, then another, moving toward us at a slow and steady pace. The steps sounded exactly like a person wearing boots, heel, and then toe pressing down into the ground, one after another. I held my breath and listened. The sound was getting closer to our tent. I could hear it over the quiet rustle of grass outside. There was also breathing, raspy, uneven breathing, like someone who'd been walking a long time in the cold air. It wasn't animal panting. It was human breathing, deep and ragged. My stomach twisted hard as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag. The person moved closer. I could hear each footstep in the moss, slow and careful. Then there was a sudden noise of something falling over. It was our clothes drying rack. I felt a jolt of pure panic run through my chest. My friend shifted beside me. I could feel him wake up as well. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest so loud it felt like it was shaking my whole body. Whoever was out there was still standing near the tent. The breathing was louder now, almost right outside. I lay there staring at the tent wall, seeing the faint outline of the person's shadow in the dim moonlight. They didn't move for a while. They just stood there breathing, the sound rasping in and out, uneven, like they were trying to stay quiet, but couldn't keep control. Then the footsteps started again, faster this time. The person ran past our tent, away from the campgrounds, away from the direction we'd come. The footsteps faded quickly into the distance. What made my blood turn to ice was that I never heard the shuffle of a pack or gear as they ran. No clinking of metal, no shifting of straps, nothing. It was like they were running with nothing on them at all. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake for hours, eyes wide open, staring at the roof of the tent in the dark. I could hear my friend breathing just as shallow as mine, neither of us saying anything. The cold seeped into my bones until I felt like I was frozen solid. Every time the wind moved the tent fabric, I jumped, thinking they had come back. My ears strained to pick up any sound outside, footsteps, breathing, voices, anything. but it was just the wind and the faint gurgle of the stream. Finally, the sun rose. The tent brightened with pale yellow light. I felt like I hadn't slept at all. We unzipped the tent and stepped out into the freezing morning air. My whole body felt stiff and aching, but I forced myself to move around and check the area. Our clothes drying rack was broken into pieces on the moss. The shirts and socks we'd left on it were scattered around, some half buried in wet grass, some stuck on the ends of bushes. I walked around the tent looking for tracks. The ground was soft enough to show prints clearly. There were small boot prints in the moss and dirt leading toward the tent, and then away from it, running off in the direction of the valley bottom and deeper into the wilderness. The prints were definitely human. Small boots, like a teenager's size or a small adult. Each step was clear, pressed deep into the damp moss. They were the only footprints there apart from ours from the day before. I followed them for a few meters before they disappeared into the brush. My heart was pounding again as I stood there looking into the valley. There was nothing out there except endless grass, small streams, and mountains rising on the far side. I couldn't see anyone walking away. There was nowhere to go unless they planned to cross the mountains, and the nearest town that way was over 100 miles away through unbroken wilderness. We packed up camp as fast as we could. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag and stuffed it into my pack. I didn't even bother cleaning off my boots properly, just stomped them against a rock to get rid of the worst of the mud. We strapped everything down in silence, eyes darting around at every sound in the brush, every movement of grass in the wind. I kept looking up at the ridges, expecting to see someone standing there watching us, but there was nothing. We climbed out of the valley, pushing ourselves hard despite the weight of our packs. My legs burned with every step, and sweat ran down my back under my coat. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of that place and back to the campground. We didn't speak the whole time, just kept moving, our breathing ragged in the cold air. The sun was bright, and the sky was clear, but I couldn't shake the cold dread from my chest. I felt like we were being watched the whole way back, but every time I turned to look, there was only empty tundra and ridges. When we finally reached the campground, the relief was so strong my knees almost gave out. We dumped our packs by the truck and just sat there in silence, drinking the last of our water. I kept looking down the trail, half expecting to see those boot prints following us back. But no one came. We drove out as soon as we could, the tires crunching over the gravel road leading away from the empty campground. The mountains faded into the distance behind us, blue and silent under the cloudless sky. I didn't say anything for hours. My friend didn't either. We just sat in that silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Even now I still think about it. About those footsteps in the night. The breathing. The boot prints leading away into the empty valley. I still wonder who it was, what they were doing out there, alone, in the middle of nowhere with no pack and no gear. And I still think about how they never came from the direction of the campground, only from deeper in the wilderness. There was nothing out there, just miles and miles of tundra and mountains. After that trip, I didn't go camping for a long time. Every time I closed my eyes to sleep, I heard those footsteps again, coming closer, slow and steady, with that raspy breathing in the dark. I woke up that morning with a heavy head and a slight ache in my lower back from the hard mattress. The cabin wasn't exactly a luxury place to stay in, but it was cheap and quiet, and that was all I wanted. I had booked it for 4 nights to get away from everything. My job had been eating at me lately, with meetings that dragged into late evenings and my phone buzzing nonstop. I just needed silence. I needed to hear the sound of wind through trees instead of keyboards and office chatter. The cabin was about a 20-minute drive off the main road. The dirt path was uneven, with sharp turns and big dips that made my old car complain the entire way up. The cabin itself was a single-room building with an attached bathroom. It had a small porch with 2 wooden chairs and a rusted metal table. The door was solid wood with a simple latch lock and a separate padlock outside if I wanted to use it. That first morning, after waking up late, I cooked myself some eggs on the old gas stove. The cabin smelled like damp wood and a faint hint of propane, but it was better than the city smell. I sat on the porch, sipping burnt coffee from a chipped mug, looking at the endless rows of pine trees surrounding the place. The sun was climbing slowly over the tops of the trees, lighting up patches of the ground in bright gold. There was no sound except the birds, a few flies buzzing near the porch railing, and the far-off creak of trees swaying with the wind. Around noon, I decided to explore a bit. There was a small dirt trail leading away from the cabin, so I put on my hiking boots, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked. The air felt fresh and cool, and it smelled of pine needles and dry leaves. As I walked, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Every step took me further from my thoughts about work, rent, bills, and people I didn't want to see. I walked for nearly 2 hours before turning back. I didn't want to be too far out when it started getting dark. Back at the cabin, I lit a fire in the metal ring out front and sat by it until the sun dipped below the trees. That evening, as the shadows stretched longer and the air turned cold, I went inside, shut the door, and locked it. I read a few pages of an old book I found in the cabin's shelf, something about deer hunting, before falling asleep with the dim yellow lamp buzzing beside me. The quietness was almost too much. I could hear my heartbeat against the pillow. The next morning, I woke up early just before dawn. I decided to go for another walk, this time in the opposite direction of yesterday. I walked for an hour before coming across a broken wooden fence, covered in moss and leaning at an angle. Beyond it, there was a clearing with rotting logs and a pile of rusted metal scraps. It looked like an old work site, maybe for logging. There were a few empty tin cans, some rusted nails, and pieces of what looked like fencing wire tangled in the grass. I poked around for a while, looking at everything, before heading back. That evening, I cooked rice and canned beans on the stove. The air inside the cabin felt heavy and hot, even though it was cold outside. I opened the window for a bit to let fresh air in, but closed it quickly when insects started flying inside. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I started drifting off, I heard something. A faint noise from outside, leaves crunching, a soft thud on the porch. I told myself it was animals, deer or raccoons, maybe even a bear looking for food, but my chest felt tight with unease. I stayed still under the blanket, listening. After what felt like an hour, the noises stopped, and I finally slept. The third morning, I woke up tired. My eyes burned, and my mouth felt dry. I drank a full bottle of water while standing at the window, staring out into the trees. The sky was cloudy, and there was a sharp chill in the air. I didn't feel like walking that day, so I stayed around the cabin, chopping wood for the fire pit, and cleaning up some branches that had fallen nearby. In the late afternoon, I saw a car drive past on the dirt road. It was an old silver pickup with a dented side panel. It drove slow, tires crunching on gravel, then sped up and disappeared around the bend. I watched it from the porch, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold. I didn't know anyone around here. The nearest cabin was about 5 miles away, according to the owner. I wondered if the driver was lost or just passing through to get deeper into the forest trails. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. I lay in bed reading until my eyes closed on their own. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sharp noise. My eyes snapped open. My body felt frozen for a second. The cabin was pitch dark except for the faint orange glow of the dying embers in the stove. I heard the noise again, a slow creaking sound, like wood under weight. My ears strained. I heard the faintest shuffle outside the window. My chest tightened. I stayed still, breathing as quiet as I could. I felt the mattress pressing into my back, my heartbeat thudding up into my throat. I listened to every single sound. There was a scraping noise, then a thud, as if something was placed on the porch floorboards. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. Minutes passed with no sound. My thoughts raced. I imagined a bear sniffing around, or some drunk hunter looking for shelter. After what felt like an hour, I gathered the courage to get up. My legs felt weak as I stood up from the bed. I crept towards the window and tried to peer through the side without being seen. Outside, it was pure blackness. The moon was hidden behind clouds. I couldn't see anything. I pressed my ear against the window screen. Silence. Only the sound of my blood rushing in my head. I waited for a long time, then slowly backed away, locked the window, and crawled back into bed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, eyes open, staring into the darkness, waiting for the first glow of dawn. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously. The porch looked normal. The chairs were in their place, the small table untouched. I looked around the dirt patch in front of the cabin, checking for tracks. I didn't see any clear footprints, just scattered pine needles and small stones. Maybe it had been an animal, or maybe the noises were from the wood shrinking in the cold. I forced myself to believe that. The rest of the day I spent inside, reading and dozing on and off. Around evening, I lit the fire outside again and cooked instant noodles in a dented pot. The sky was a deep purple as the sun set, and the temperature dropped fast. I stayed by the fire until the cold bit through my jacket, then went inside. That night, I made sure the door was locked. I checked the windows twice. I even took the small hatchet from the firewood pile and placed it beside the bed. I felt stupid for doing it, but it made me feel slightly safer. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark listening. At first, it was quiet, just the ticking sound of cooling metal from the stove and the faint creak of wood beams shifting. But then I heard it again, a light step on the porch. I stopped breathing. My ears felt like they were burning with how hard I was straining to hear. Another step, this time closer to the door. My hands gripped the blanket tight. The sound of the door latch moved, just slightly, like someone testing it. My chest felt like it was going to explode. My eyes were wide open in the darkness. I waited, barely breathing. The latch moved again. Then a dull thud against the door, not hard enough to force it open, just enough to rattle it slightly in the frame. The cabin was silent except for that. My hands were shaking. I reached over and grabbed the hatchet, holding it to my chest. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. The door stayed shut. I heard another step, this time moving away from the door, and then silence. I sat there, knees pulled to my chest, hatchet gripped tight, until dawn. My body hurt from the way I was curled up, and my head felt heavy and dizzy from lack of sleep. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. The morning air was freezing. My breath came out in white clouds. I looked around the porch, at the dirt ground, at the bushes by the corner of the cabin. Nothing. No footprints, no marks, nothing moved or out of place. I walked around the cabin twice, heart hammering in my chest. It felt like the forest was staring back at me, silent and uncaring. That was my last morning there. I went back inside, packed my bag, and cleaned up quickly. I didn't bother cooking breakfast. I just wanted to leave. The cabin felt different now. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt heavy, pressing into my chest and making it hard to breathe. When I drove away, the dirt path felt longer and rougher than before. Every bump rattled my bones. I didn't relax until I saw the main road come into view. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. I sat in my car for a while, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel until the blood flowed back into my fingers. I never found out what was outside that night. Maybe it was just an animal curious about the smell of food. Maybe it was a person looking for an empty cabin to break into. I don't know. But the fear I felt sitting there in the dark, listening to someone or something test my door, stayed with me for months. Even now, when I wake up in the middle of the night in my apartment, I sometimes hear phantom creaks and quiet footsteps in my mind, and my chest tightens all over again. I don't think I'll ever go back to a cabin alone. The peace I thought I wanted came with a silence too deep to trust. I woke up early that morning feeling tired from the drive the day before. My neck was stiff from the car seat, and the muscles in my lower back felt tight. I looked around the cabin. The place was small, just one big room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove in the middle, a worn-out couch by the window, and my sleeping bag spread out on the wooden floor. The floorboards were rough and scratched, with dirt trapped between the boards. A few black ants walked across the edge of my sleeping bag. I brushed them away and sat up. The light coming through the window was dim and gray. Outside, the sky was cloudy and the forest around the cabin looked dark. The air inside felt damp and cold, so I pulled on my hoodie before stepping out onto the small porch. My shoes made a hollow sound on the old wood. The forest was silent, except for a few birds far off in the trees. I stretched my arms and yawned. My breath came out in small white clouds. I had come out here to take a break from everything. Work, people, traffic, and the loud neighbors in my apartment building. This cabin belonged to a friend of my uncle's. It was about 40 miles from the nearest town, down a bumpy dirt road that twisted through pine forests and grassy hills. There was no electricity, no running water except a metal hand pump by the porch, and no cell signal. I had packed canned food, a bag of rice, some potatoes, a gas stove, a few bottles of water, a flashlight, and a battery-powered lantern. That morning, I made myself a small breakfast on the porch. I heated up a can of beans, ate half of it straight from the can, then put on my boots and walked around the cabin. The grass was wet with dew, sticking to my pants up to my knees. Behind the cabin, the trees stood thick and close together. They smelled of sap and wet earth. There was an old axe stuck into a stump, its handle worn and splintered. I pulled it out and swung it a few times to loosen up my shoulders, then chopped some small dead branches from the ground for the stove later. Each crack of the wood echoed through the trees, and the smell of fresh wood chips filled the cool morning air. I spent most of that day reading on the porch, walking short distances down the dirt road, and picking up pine cones to toss into the woods. Every time I walked away from the cabin, I kept looking back at it, checking that it was still there behind me. The cabin looked small and weak against the tall trees and cloudy sky. I felt a tight feeling in my chest every time I realized how alone I was out here. But that was the point, to feel alone for once, to hear my own thoughts clearly, and to see if I could stand it. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees in long waves, making the branches creak and scrape against each other. I sat on the porch with my lantern, watching the trees move in the wind. The shadows shifted back and forth across the dirt. It felt like something was walking between the trees, but I knew it was just the branches swaying. I went inside before it got too late, locked the old door with its thin latch, and set my lantern on the wood stove. The light filled the small cabin with a soft yellow glow. I laid down in my sleeping bag and pulled it tight around my shoulders. The wind pressed against the walls, making the old wood creak and pop. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was still dark. The lantern had burned out. The only sound was the wind outside and the old boards of the cabin shifting in the cold. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling. My eyes adjusted, and I could see the outline of the window against the darkness. Then I heard a noise outside. It was a short, sharp crack, like a branch snapping. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, louder this time, and then I heard footsteps in the dirt outside the cabin. My heart started beating hard in my chest. I lay completely still, my hands tucked under my sleeping bag. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and heavy, crunching in the dry pine needles and dirt. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or an elk wandering by. But the footsteps were too careful, each one landing with a soft crunch. Pause, crunch, pause. They stopped outside the window. I could hear breathing, deep and steady. The breathing didn't move away for a long time. I stared at the window, expecting to see a shadow pass by, but there was nothing, just the faint gray light of the night sky. After what felt like an hour, the footsteps started again. They moved away from the window, around the side of the cabin, and then faded into the woods. I lay there listening to the wind and my own heartbeat in the dark. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, the sky was clear and blue. The forest looked bright and harmless in the daylight. I walked outside and looked around the cabin. The dirt was covered in old pine needles and patches of grass, but near the window, the ground was clear. I could see footprints there. They were human footprints, wide and heavy, with the tread of worn-out boots pressed into the dirt. The tracks led from the trees to the window, then around the side of the cabin, and disappeared into the woods behind it. I felt sick in my stomach. My hands were shaking. I walked around the cabin 3 times, looking for any sign of who it was, but the tracks ended where the pine needles began. I packed my bag quickly, shoving my sleeping bag and food back into the duffel. I loaded it into the car and drove away without looking back. My shoulders stayed tight the whole drive down the dirt road, expecting to see someone standing between the trees or behind a bush, watching me leave. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got home. I unpacked my things, washed my clothes, and tried to sleep in my own bed that night. But I kept thinking about the way those footsteps sounded in the dirt outside the cabin, how they paused outside the window for so long, how whoever it was just stood there, breathing, watching, waiting. A week later, I called my uncle's friend to tell him what happened. He said he hadn't been up to the cabin in months, and no one should have been up there. He thanked me for letting him know, said he'd drive up the next weekend to check the place. I didn't ask him if he found anything. I didn't want to know. Since then, I haven't gone back to any cabin in the woods. I still like nature, and I still like quiet places. But now I think about how empty forests aren't really empty, and how the walls of a small wooden cabin can feel like paper when you hear footsteps outside in the dark. I think about how I lay there, not moving, not breathing, feeling my own heartbeat in my ears, waiting for the door to open or the window to break. But nothing happened that night, and I left the next morning alive and unharmed. That's what I hold on to now, that I got out of there, that I made it home, that whoever was out there stayed outside. But deep down, I know it could have ended differently. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my head, slow and heavy, walking around my room in the dark, stopping by my window, breathing, waiting for me to move. And I lay there quiet and still, hoping they walk away again. I remember that night clearly. The kind of night that stays with you even years later, sitting in your mind like a quiet weight that never fully lifts. We had been sailing along the coast of Papua New Guinea, part of a research mission gathering oceanographic data and mapping coral beds. It was the kind of work I liked, calm, methodical, and far away from the crowded ports and busy shipping lanes. I was the navigation officer, and by the time the sun set, we were still about an hour from where we had planned to anchor for the night. We arrived in the small bay around 10 p.m. There was no moon, just the endless dark above us, dotted with a few bright stars where the cloud cover broke. The water was flat and black, and the sound of it lapping against the hull felt almost louder than normal in the silence of the bay. The engines rumbled down to idle, and the deck crew moved quietly, voices low out of habit and respect for the hour, as they went through the anchor routine. I went over to the chart table to mark our position, making sure everything was logged correctly before we settled in for the night. The ship rocked gently, and the dim red lights of the bridge kept the glare down so I could see the instruments clearly. As I drew a small circle around our GPS position on the chart, I noticed a faded pencil annotation in the corner of the bay. Native village reported an area. I glanced out the bridge windows. The coast was just a dark mass, barely separated from the sky. There were no fires, no lights, nothing to show there was anyone there at all. I didn't think too much about it. Over the years, I had marked hundreds of these little notes on charts. Sometimes they were decades old, sometimes they were wrong. I finished up, checked the anchor alarm, and then flicked on all the deck and underwater lights before going back to my chair in the wheelhouse to stand my watch. The underwater lights cast a wide greenish glow all around the ship, shimmering against the hull. Above that, the deck lights lit up the working areas with harsh white light, leaving the outer edges of the ship falling off sharply into blackness. Because of a light mist drifting across the bay, the light didn't reach far. I couldn't see beyond maybe 25 yards from the ship before it just turned into a gray-black curtain. Everything beyond that was hidden. I sat there in the quiet, feeling the humid air blow through the open bridge door. I always left the door open at night if the weather was good. I liked the smell of the tropics at night, the slight dampness mixed with salt and earth. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the distant sound of insects from shore mixing with the gentle slap of water against the hull. The ship creaked softly, ropes tightening and loosening with the movement of the tide. Now and then, I heard splashing. Light, quick splashes. I got up and walked out on the starboard bridge wing, leaning over the railing to look down. Often the underwater lights attracted small fish, sometimes hundreds of them, swirling in frantic silver schools under the hull. I watched for a minute, but saw nothing. Just the shifting pale green glow of the lights, illuminating empty water below me. I went back inside and sat down, scanning the radar and the depth sounder out of habit. The radar was useless that close to shore. It showed only our own echoes and the mass of land nearby. The AIS was empty too. We were alone in the bay. But the splashing continued. Not constant, just faint and random, coming from somewhere out in the dark. I tried to ignore it for a while. I wrote up the evening log, checked our position again, and looked over the weather forecast for the next day. But every so often I would hear another quick splash or two. Always faint, always from somewhere beyond the edge of the light. Finally, I decided to go check again. I walked out onto the aft deck. The ship was silent except for the low hum of the generators. The mist made the floodlights glow softly, lighting up the wet deck plates and the railings that dripped with condensation. I walked along the port side, looking down at the water, leaning over the rails to see under the hull where I could. Nothing. Just ripples rolling away into darkness. The air felt thick on my skin, warm and sticky. After a few minutes, I gave up and went back into the bridge. But something kept gnawing at me. Maybe it was just that the mist made everything feel muffled and hidden, or maybe it was the darkness pressing in around the light. Whatever it was, I felt unsettled. I decided to check the infrared cameras just to clear my mind. The cameras were old but reliable, bolted high on the mast with a good field of view around the ship. I flicked them on and turned the monitor brightness down, so my eyes didn't have to adjust too much from the dark bridge. For a moment, all I saw was the usual fuzzy gray-black landscape, the faint outlines of the railings, and the faint heat signatures of the engine casing under the deck. I swept the camera around slowly, panning out across the water. And then I saw them. At first I couldn't quite make sense of it. The screen showed faint, ghostly shapes sitting low on the water, dozens of them. As I tilted the camera and focused, the shapes sharpened into long, narrow outlines with pale blurs inside them. Canoes. Maybe 50 of them, just outside the bright pool of our underwater lights, sitting silently in the dark. Each canoe had about 3 people in it, their bodies glowing slightly warmer than the water around them. They weren't moving much, just sitting still watching us. Some would paddle slightly to keep their position, the thin strokes making no sound I could hear over the generators. I felt something sink deep in my chest then, a cold emptiness, like the feeling you get when you think you're alone in a room and turn around to see someone standing right behind you. My skin prickled all over. I was suddenly aware of how exposed I was, standing up there in the bridge with the lights glowing behind me, every movement visible through the windows. For a while I just stared at the screen, moving the camera from group to group. None of them were close enough for their faces to be clear, just pale ovals turning now and then. They were out there in the dark, silent, invisible to my eyes, but watching us all the same. The bay felt bigger somehow. The ship felt smaller. After a minute, I called up a deckhand. I didn't want to be alone anymore. He came up sleepy-eyed and barefoot, rubbing his arms against the night chill. I told him to do a quick walk around the decks with me. We walked slowly, from the bow to the stern, our footsteps loud on the metal plates. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Both of us felt it, the feeling of eyes on us from the dark. I kept thinking about what they might be doing out there. Were they curious? Were they waiting for something? Did they see our ship as a threat, or just as an unknown light in their bay? There was no way to tell. I imagined what it looked like from their perspective, sitting in those canoes with the water quiet under them, the dark pressing down, and then this huge floating structure glowing with white and green lights, humming and silent except for the occasional figure walking along its edges. We kept the watch that way all night. The deckhand made himself a cup of instant coffee and stayed on the aft deck, leaning against the railing and watching the black water. I stayed in the bridge, flicking the cameras every half hour to see if they were still there. They were, all night, just sitting and watching. Sometimes one canoe would drift closer and then paddle back out again, keeping to that outer ring of darkness. I didn't sleep. When the first faint gray light of dawn started to break over the eastern hills, the mist turned silver. Slowly, the outlines of the canoes began to appear to the naked eye. Long, narrow hulls carved from wood, some with outriggers attached, low in the water. I saw the figures more clearly then, men mostly, a few women, all looking towards us quietly. The sky brightened to pale blue, and the colors of the land started to show, the dark green trees, the reddish earth of the hills. As the sun rose higher, they began to paddle in closer. Some smiled and waved. A few of the older men stood up in their canoes and gestured towards the deck. We lowered the accommodation ladder, and they came alongside. They brought carved wooden bowls, bundles of bright feathers, and small hand-woven baskets to trade for packets of rice, tinned meat, and fishing line. They spoke a little English, enough to tell us they hadn't seen a ship in their bay for many years. They were curious and friendly, their eyes bright with quiet interest as they looked over our equipment and the steel walls of the ship. By late morning, the canoes drifted away again, paddling back towards the small inlet we could now see clearly tucked between the trees. The bay felt calm and safe again, like nothing had happened during the night. But as I stood at the rail, feeling the warmth of the sun on my shoulders, I couldn't shake that feeling from hours earlier. The feeling of being watched by so many unseen eyes in the dark. The feeling of being so completely alone and exposed under that black sky, floating in a place that was not mine. That night taught me something about the ocean, about the land, about myself. No matter how big your ship is, no matter how many lights you turn on, or how many systems you check, you are still just a visitor. The dark does not belong to you. The silence does not belong to you. It belongs to the people who know it by heart. The ones who can sit in it for hours, paddling quietly, watching without being seen. And it reminded me that fear does not always come from danger. Sometimes it comes from realizing how small you really are in the world, how you can be surrounded by others in the night and still feel like the only soul alive. That was the feeling I carried with me from that bay. Not terror, not relief, but a quiet, lasting knowledge of my own smallness floating there under the stars. When we pulled anchor later that day and headed back out to sea, I stood on the aft deck and watched the bay disappear behind us into the haze. The sun was bright, the sea glittered, and the coast looked peaceful. But I knew that when night fell again, the dark would close over it, silent and deep, and they would still be there, paddling their narrow canoes under the I used to have a buddy that lived just a few streets over from me. We grew up in the same area, went to the same high school, and even worked together for a while before he changed jobs. We weren't best friends in the deep, emotional sense, but we were the kind of friends who could sit in silence with a couple beers, talking about random nonsense or nothing at all, and it would still be comfortable. His house was maybe a 15-minute walk from mine, give or take, depending on how fast I walked, and if I took the shortcut through the little drainage trail between two streets. That night felt normal in every way. I remember I had finished mowing my yard earlier in the afternoon. It was warm, but not too hot, and the sun was out. After I cleaned up, I sat on my porch for a while, just enjoying the breeze, watching people walking their dogs and cars rolling past with music thumping out their windows. Around 7:30, my buddy texted me, asking if I wanted to come over for some cards and a couple beers. I didn't have anything else going on that evening and thought it'd be good to get out for a bit, so I told him I'd head over after dinner. I made myself a quick sandwich, washed my dishes, and grabbed a light jacket in case it got chilly later. It wasn't cold yet, but late spring nights in our town could go from warm to biting in just a couple hours. As I walked down my street and took the right onto the next block, I noticed how quiet everything felt. The sun had set by then, but the sky still held onto a dark blue glow, fading to black near the top. Porch lights flicked on here and there, moths already fluttering around them. The scent of cut grass still clung to my clothes, mixing with faint whiffs of barbecues from backyards I passed. His house had the same layout as mine, just flipped, because our entire neighborhood was built by the same developer back in the early 90s. When I reached his backyard, he was already sitting at the little fold-up table he kept next to the shed, with a deck of cards laid out and a couple cans of Coors Light sweating on the surface. He greeted me with a nod and a grin, and I sat down across from him. We started playing cards. I can't even remember what game we played that night. Probably rummy, maybe a round of blackjack in between, just casual games while we talked about his job and how his boss had pissed him off that week, or about the new movie he wanted to see in theaters. I remember we talked about his neighbor's dog barking nonstop, and how he was thinking about getting one of those ultrasonic bark controllers. We laughed about how he'd probably end up silencing every dog within 5 houses if he actually bought one. The beer felt cold and crisp, but I only had 2 cans the entire time I was there. I knew I had to wake up early the next day to take my truck in for an oil change before work. I kept checking my phone now and then, watching the time slip by. Just before 10, I finished the last sip of my second beer and stood up. I felt totally fine, no buzz, not even a faint one. Just relaxed and ready to go home to shower and sleep. I tossed the empty can into the recycle bin by his back door, stretched my back, and told him I was heading out. He nodded and told me to text him later in the week to plan a fishing trip. I said I would. Then I walked out of his yard, through his side gate, and down his driveway to the street. I remember the walk back home vividly. It was peaceful. The street lights were on, throwing cones of soft orange light onto the pavement every few houses. A few cars were parked along the street, but no one was out walking their dogs anymore. The sky was completely dark by then, stars flickering through a thin haze. I took the shortcut through the drainage trail like I always did, stepping around a big puddle that never seemed to dry out no matter how little it rained. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and weeds. I walked past the little grove of eucalyptus trees, listening to the leaves rustle high up in the branches. When I got back to my street, I could see my house clearly from the end of the block. My truck was parked in the driveway, angled just a little because the edge of the concrete was cracked, and I always parked to avoid putting a tire on it. The porch light was still on, casting a yellow glow over the little welcome mat that was frayed around the edges. I fished my keys out of my pocket as I walked up the path to the door, feeling the familiar weight of them in my hand. I remember thinking about the oil change again, wondering if I should go right at opening to beat the rush. That was when my roommate came out of the front door. He had a travel mug in his hand, steam rising from it in the cool air, and he was wearing his work uniform. His hair was still damp from the shower. He looked at me with this confused expression, his eyebrows drawing together like he couldn't quite make sense of what he was seeing. I didn't think anything of it at first. I figured maybe he woke up to grab something from his car before going back to bed. But then he looked at me again longer, and I could see he was fully awake, like he was about to leave for work. I didn't understand what was happening. I remember feeling this weird chill run down my arms, like my body knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. I looked at the sky. It was still dark, but there was a hint of pale blue starting to show near the horizon, just the barest suggestion of dawn. My stomach felt like it dropped. I looked at my truck again, sitting right there where I always parked it, and then back at him as he sipped his coffee. I walked inside behind him, my boots scuffing across the entryway tile. The house felt different, like the air was heavier somehow. I went straight to the living room and checked the clock on the cable box under the TV. 5:17 a.m. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to double check. Same time, 5:17 a.m. My heart started to pound in my chest so hard I could feel it thumping in my neck. My hands felt sweaty all of a sudden, and my knees felt weak like I had just sprinted up a hill. I tried to think logically. I thought maybe I had fallen asleep at my buddy's house, maybe just dozed off for a while. But I knew that wasn't true. I remembered everything clearly. I remembered standing up, tossing my can, stretching, saying bye, walking out, taking the shortcut, stepping around the puddle, feeling the cool air on my face. Everything felt real. Nothing felt like a dream or sleepwalking or anything else I could explain away. I paced the living room in circles, feeling the carpet fibers under my boots, hearing the faint creak of the subfloor beneath me in one spot by the recliner. I pulled my phone back out and scrolled to my last text messages. The last message was to my buddy at around 7:30, telling him I was coming over after dinner. No other messages. No calls. I went to my call history and called him. It rang a few times before he answered, sounding half asleep with his voice all scratchy. I asked him what time I left. He said I left just before 10. He didn't sound confused or worried, just tired. I thanked him and hung up. Then I stood there in the dim living room, staring at the blank TV screen reflecting my own confused face back at me. My roommate left for work like he always did around that time, and I sat down on the couch, feeling the worn cushion give under my weight. I sat there with my elbows on my knees, my hands dangling between them, staring at the floor for a long time. The faint lines of the carpet pattern blurred together as my eyes unfocused. I felt this creeping coldness inside my chest, like something was sitting there that I didn't understand, something that wasn't supposed to be there. My brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe I had a seizure or a blackout, but I'd never had anything like that before, and nothing like it ever happened again. Maybe someone slipped something in my beer, but there was no one there to do it, and I only had 2 beers anyway. Maybe I fell and hit my head on the way home, but I didn't have a single bruise or scratch, not even a speck of dirt on my jeans. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except that I had lost 7 hours of my life. The sun came up slowly while I sat there. Light started to filter through the slats of the blinds, casting lines of orange and gold across the living room carpet. The silence felt heavy, like the walls themselves were pressing in around me. I could hear birds chirping outside, the distant sound of a car door slamming as someone left for work. But none of it felt real. It felt like I was underwater, hearing everything from far away. Eventually I stood up and went to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, watching the drops roll down into the sink. My eyes looked the same as always in the mirror. Nothing about me looked different. I dried my face with a towel and went to the kitchen to make coffee, trying to force myself back into a routine. I had to take my truck in, after all. Life didn't stop just because time decided to disappear. That day felt like a fog. I sat in the waiting room of the shop, staring at the muted TV, showing some morning news show. The mechanic called me up when my truck was ready, and I paid without really listening to what he said about the next maintenance interval. I drove home, parked in the driveway, and just sat there for a while with the engine off, feeling the heat building inside the cab as the sun beat down on the roof. Years have passed since then, but I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. I never told anyone else except my buddy, and even then I left out the part about how scared it made me feel. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind, but it sits in the back of my brain all the time, like a loose tooth that I can't stop poking at with my tongue. Where did those hours go? What happened to me during that time? There is no answer, no explanation, and that's what makes it worse. I still walk that same route sometimes when I go to visit him, and every time, when I reach the puddle in the drainage trail, I feel that chill run down my arms again. I feel my chest tighten like it remembers something my mind never could. I keep my eyes on the cracked concrete, my ears tuned to every little sound in the dark, half expecting to feel the world shift around me again. But it never has. Nothing like it has ever happened again. I wish I could say that I found out what happened, that I remembered or discovered some logical. I always thought working late nights at the movie theater would be peaceful. Everyone else would be gone, the halls empty, no kids running around dropping popcorn everywhere, no parents yelling at teenagers behind the counter. Just me and whoever was closing with me, finishing up inventory, counting money, wiping counters, listening to music in the quiet dark lobby. That was my routine. I liked it. I liked how calm the theater felt after closing, with all the bright signs shut off and the ticket booth window dark. Even the parking lot lights felt comforting in their own way, spreading out in the emptiness like quiet islands of safety. That night wasn't supposed to be any different. It was a weekday, maybe a Wednesday or Thursday. I can't remember for sure now. The last movie let out around 11:30, and by midnight the last stragglers were gone. Me and another manager, her name was Rachel, were in the little office behind concessions. The office wasn't anything special, just a tiny square room with 2 metal desks squeezed in. A single chair at each desk, stacks of paper everywhere, pens scattered, the nightly deposit bag sitting open on one side, a small TV monitor that showed the security camera feeds, and the old CD player we always used at night. The CD player sat against the back wall near where Rachel was counting cash. It was just a cheap black player with a handle, the kind everyone used to have in school classrooms. We kept a stack of CDs beside it, all random burned discs people left behind or the cleaning crew found in lost and found bins over the years. Sometimes we would put on 80s rock, sometimes jazz, sometimes movie soundtracks. It just depended on who was closing and what mood we were in. That night, I think I put in some soft classic rock, stuff that played quietly enough that we could still hear the front lobby if anyone came in late. I remember standing up from my chair to change the CD because the previous one finished, and the silence felt heavy. I flipped through a few of the discs, picked one that said Classic Mix 2 in black Sharpie, slid it into the tray, and hit play. I sat back down in my squeaky chair. Rachel was focused on her money count, flipping through the bills, sorting them into neat piles like she always did. I turned my attention back to my inventory sheets. I was almost done for the night. All I had left to do was add in the bottled drinks and candy boxes from the front counter and the candy rack by the ticket booth, then submit the numbers into the computer system before closing it down. Less than a minute passed after I sat down when it happened. I didn't hear anything first. There was no warning sound or creak or shift. All I saw was the entire stack of CDs next to the player suddenly lift off and launch across the room. It wasn't like they just fell over or slipped off the table. They flew, like someone had grabbed them in a sweeping arm movement and thrown them as hard as they could. Discs flew everywhere. Some clattered off the metal filing cabinet. Some hit the wall above Rachel's head. One slammed right into the back of her head and bounced off, landing on the floor behind her chair. I froze. My whole body felt like it locked up. I stared at the CDs scattered all over the linoleum floor. Some landed near my feet, some slid under the desks. Rachel sat there hunched forward, her hands still on the money piles. She turned around slowly, looked at me, looked at the CDs around me, then looked back at me again. I remember her eyes were wide, almost blank, like she was trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. I didn't say anything. I didn't even move for a few seconds. My chest felt tight. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The air felt heavier than before, like there was no oxygen left in the small room. Eventually I stood up, my knees shaking a little, and started picking up the CDs. Rachel rubbed the back of her head where the disc had hit her. She didn't say anything. She just went back to counting the cash, her shoulders stiff and her eyes focused down. I finished gathering the CDs and set them back in a stack by the CD player. but this time I didn't stand them up. I laid them flat so they couldn't fall or slide. I sat back down and finished my inventory numbers as fast as I could, not even checking the counts twice like I normally did. I just wanted to get out of there. The air felt wrong in that room. I couldn't focus on anything except the memory of those discs flying. It kept playing back in my mind like a silent movie, over and over, the way they lifted off and exploded across the office. When we finally finished the deposit and the paperwork, we locked up the office and walked out together. Neither of us turned off the CD player that night. It kept playing quietly as we left, its music following us out into the dark lobby. We set the alarms, locked the front doors, and walked out to our cars in silence. The parking lot felt even emptier than usual. I kept glancing around as I walked, half expecting to see someone standing out there watching us. But there was no one, just the buzzing orange streetlights and the wind rustling paper scraps across the asphalt. I didn't think much more about it after that night. I didn't want to. I told myself there had to be some explanation. The stack was unstable. Maybe I bumped the desk when I sat down. Maybe there was a small tremor I didn't feel. Anything. I just didn't want to think about it. I kept working my closing shifts. Nothing happened again for a couple days. Then later that week, I got a call in the morning from Lisa, another manager who worked days. I was still half asleep when she called. Her voice sounded tense, and she didn't say good morning like she usually did. She just asked me what we were doing the other night after close. I remember staring at my phone in confusion, scratching my head. I asked her what she meant. She asked me again, this time sounding annoyed, why we had dumped all the security tapes on the floor and left them there. I sat up in bed when she said that. I told her we hadn't touched the security tapes. We hadn't even looked at them. The tapes were stored on a small shelf above the CCTV monitor in the office. Each tape had its own black sleeve with a sticker labeled with the date and camera number. We never touched them unless we needed to pull footage for something. And even then, we put everything back exactly how it was. It was drilled into us by the general manager because he didn't want to get audited and find missing or unorganized footage. Lisa told me when she opened the office that morning, every single tape was on the floor in front of the CCTV monitor. The shelf was still perfectly in place, screwed into the wall, unmoved. But the tapes were just piled in a mess, and every single black sleeve had been removed and thrown all over the office. She said it looked like someone had pulled them all down in a hurry, ripped the sleeves off, and tossed everything around without caring. She spent an hour reorganizing them that morning before the GM came in. I didn't know what to say. I just told her again that we hadn't touched them. After I hung up, I sat there on my bed for a long time staring at the carpet. My apartment felt quiet and cold. I kept thinking back to that night, how we left in a rush, how the CDs flew without warning, how the air felt heavy and wrong afterwards. I thought maybe someone came in after we left, but that didn't make sense. The alarms were set, and the cameras would have caught it. Besides, why would someone come in just to mess with the tapes? After that, I started feeling uneasy every time I walked into the office at night. I'd sit down at my desk, open my inventory folder, and glance at the CD stack, then up at the CCTV monitor with the small tape shelf above it. I couldn't focus like I used to. Every little sound made me flinch. The building creaked and settled like old buildings do, and the soda machines in concessions made their quiet hum, but everything felt sharper in the silence, like it all meant something I couldn't see. I started finishing my work faster, skipping small cleaning tasks to leave earlier. I stopped listening to music at night. The CD player stayed off. Sometimes Rachel or another closer would ask why I didn't want music, but I just shrugged it off and said I liked the quiet. Really, I just couldn't stand looking at the CD stack anymore. It reminded me of the way those discs lifted off like they were weightless and scattered across the room in an instant. Months passed, and nothing else happened like that again. Occasionally tapes would be slightly out of place, or a candy box would be on the floor when no one remembered dropping it, but nothing that felt so deliberate and violent. Still, the memory stuck with me. Even years later, after I quit working there and moved on to a different job, I would think back to those closing shifts. I'd remember sitting in that tiny office, the flickering light above the filing cabinet, the quiet hum of the CCTV monitor, the smell of stale popcorn and cleaning spray, and that feeling of watching something happen right in front of me that I couldn't explain. I never told anyone outside work about it. I didn't see the point. It sounded stupid to say, a stack of CDs flew across the room by themselves. or someone pulled down all the security tapes and threw their sleeves everywhere overnight. It sounded like a dumb ghost story, and I don't believe in that stuff. I still don't, but whatever happened that night felt real. The CDs really did fly. The tapes really did end up on the floor. Maybe there's some normal reason behind it that I'll never know. Maybe someone was messing with us and managed to do it without alarms or cameras catching them, though that idea never made sense either. All I know is after that, closing never felt peaceful again. Every creak of the ceiling or thump from the settling building made my heart race. I kept my head down and did my job, but I never felt alone in that office again, even when no one else was there. Every single night after, when I locked the front doors and stepped out into the cold, empty parking lot under the streetlights, I walked a little faster to my car, unlocked it with shaky hands, and never looked back at the glass doors behind me. I didn't want to see what might have been looking back. That's all there was to it. No answer. I always liked biking to work, even late at night. It gave me a bit of peace after hours of dealing with the noise and stress of the restaurant. The kitchen would be hot, the orders constant, my legs aching after standing and running dishes and wiping tables for hours. When the shift ended, usually around midnight, I'd step out into the cool air behind the restaurant and take a deep breath, feeling the sweat on my back turn cold under my shirt. Most nights, the air smelled of warm bread from the bakery across the street, mixed with the oil and leftover food smells from our dumpsters. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar, and I always felt a bit lighter knowing I was done for the day. My bike was old but reliable, silver with black handlebars that had worn down to the metal under my grip. The seat squeaked whenever I shifted my weight. I kept my small front light attached, making sure the batteries never died, because most of my ride home was along a long bike trail that followed the train tracks. It was about 15 minutes if I pedaled fast. 20 if my legs felt heavy. The trail was straight, just a narrow strip of old cracked pavement with weeds pushing up along the edges and patches of gravel that rattled under my tires. On one side, there was the tall chain-link fence separating it from the train tracks, and on the other side was a shallow grassy ditch that ran down to another fence separating it from the backs of businesses or storage yards. Sometimes the ditch would collect water, and small frogs would jump away into the grass as I biked past. Most of the trail was dark at night, with only a few dim street lights spaced far apart, leaving long stretches of complete blackness between them. The darkness would swallow everything except what was in the narrow cone of my front light. I would just keep my eyes ahead and focus on that small circle of cracked pavement in front of me, listening to the whir of my wheels, the steady push and pull of my breath, and the distant sound of cars on roads far away. That night was just like any other at first. I finished my shift around 12, tied my apron to my backpack, and walked to the back door. My legs were sore, and my feet felt swollen in my shoes. My hair smelled like fried food, but I was too tired to care. I unlocked my bike, turned on the front light, checked the back reflector, and started pedaling towards the trail entrance. The roads were quiet that late, only a few cars passing on the main street, their headlights sweeping over me for a moment before disappearing around corners. The city felt asleep. When I turned onto the bike trail, the darkness wrapped around me instantly. My light cut through it, shaking a little with the bumps of the path. I remember feeling the night air on my arms, a small chill that made me speed up a little to get warm. My backpack thumped lightly against my lower back with each bump. After about 2 or 3 minutes on the trail, I noticed a dim shape behind me. At first, I thought it might be a tree or a parked bike by the side of the path, but as I kept biking, I realized it was moving. My chest tightened for a moment. I looked over my shoulder and saw a person biking behind me, no lights on their bike at all, just a shadow against the deeper black. I could barely make out the bike's wheels glinting under the occasional street light. I tried to calm myself down. Lots of people biked late at night, especially in our city. Students, night shift workers, people getting home from bars. It wasn't that weird, I told myself. I kept pedaling, feeling the ache start to build in my thighs as I pushed a little faster. The person kept the same distance behind me, not gaining but not falling back either. I passed the first main exit on the trail, one that led to a busy road with shops and a petrol station, but the person didn't turn off there. My pulse was starting to pick up. I told myself it was fine, it was a public trail, maybe they lived further down. But after that exit, the trail got quieter, and it mostly led into small suburban areas. Not a lot of people biked that late past that point. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. My hands gripped the handlebars tighter. The squeak of my bike seat seemed louder than ever. My breathing felt shallow. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, and the dark was making me paranoid. My mind was probably overreacting, making up scenarios that weren't real. But still, something felt wrong. I decided to slow down. If this person wasn't following me, they would just pass and keep biking at their normal speed. There was enough space on the trail for them to pass comfortably. I eased off the pedals, feeling my bike slow under me. The person behind me slowed too. I could hear their wheels crunching over a patch of gravel at the same speed as mine. That was when my stomach dropped. My chest felt tight. Every instinct told me this wasn't normal. I sped up again for a few seconds, feeling a rush of panic, but then forced myself to calm down. I was only a few minutes from home, but I didn't want to lead this person straight to where I lived. I didn't want them to know anything about me, especially where I slept at night. At the next exit off the trail, I turned suddenly, almost skidding out as my tires hit the small paved path leading towards a suburban street. My backpack swung a little from the motion. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I just kept biking, faster and faster, feeling the blood rush in my ears. When I got to the residential street, I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was there. He had followed me off the trail, still biking at the same distance behind me. No lights, no visible face, just a shape on a bike rolling silently under the yellow street lamps. My chest was pounding so hard it almost hurt. I could feel sweat start to drip down my sides, even though the night was cool. I turned right, then left, biking through the quiet streets lined with parked cars and small trees. The houses were dark, everyone asleep. My tires hummed over the asphalt, and his tires hummed too behind me. Every time I turned, he turned. Every time I slowed down a little, he slowed down too. I kept taking random turns, trying to confuse him, hoping he would give up and go away. But he never did. I felt like a trapped animal, my eyes scanning for any escape, my mind racing with what I would do if he caught up to me. My fingers felt numb on the handlebars from gripping so hard. I tried to think clearly, but all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the sound of his bike behind me, never speeding up, never falling back. After what felt like forever, I realized I was heading towards a long, narrow path that was only for bicycles. It was unlit, running between two rows of houses with tall hedges on either side. I knew if I went down there, he would follow me, and there would be nowhere to go, no houses visible, no cars passing by. Just darkness and the two of us. As I approached it, I saw a driveway with a car parked out front and a garage door closed, but there was a small patch of shadow by the side where two garbage bins stood. Without thinking too hard, I turned sharply into the driveway, jumped off my bike, and crouched low in the shadow between the bins and the garage wall. My breath was ragged in my chest, my heart beating so hard I thought it might explode. I felt the rough concrete under my palms as I balanced myself, trying to keep quiet. I heard him bike past the driveway entrance. His tires hissed over the pavement. Then I heard him brake hard just past the driveway, probably at the entrance to that narrow bike path. There was a scraping sound like his foot shifting on the pedal. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, my eyes wide in the dark. My bike lay on its side behind me, the small front light pointing into the wall, making my shadow dance in front of me. I reached back and clicked it off, plunging myself into complete darkness. He stayed there for what felt like minutes, but it was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. I could hear him breathing, short and sharp, just outside the driveway. I tried to calm my own breathing, forcing myself to take slow, quiet breaths, even though my chest felt tight, and I wanted to gasp for air. Then I heard his bike tires again. He started moving slowly down the narrow path. As soon as I heard the sound fade away a little, I grabbed my bike and wheeled it back out onto the street as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the handlebars. When I got to the street, I saw his shadow disappearing down the bike path, swallowed by the darkness. I got back on my bike and pedaled to the end of the street. At the intersection, I stopped and turned to look back. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was still somewhere close. I felt a rush of anger mixed with my fear. I wanted him to know that I saw him, that I wasn't just a scared girl he could follow home. I stopped under the streetlight at the intersection and just stood there straddling my bike, staring down the path he had taken. I couldn't see his face in the dark, but I hoped he could see me. I hoped he knew I wasn't going to lead him anywhere tonight. The cold air hit the sweat on my neck and made me shiver, but I stayed there for a few moments, feeling my fear slowly turn into a numb emptiness. Then I turned and biked away, taking random loops through the neighborhood for another 15 minutes. I biked in circles, down streets I'd never been on before, past dark houses with curtained windows and empty driveways, under yellow streetlights that flickered overhead, until finally I felt alone again. Until finally I felt sure he wasn't behind me anymore. When I finally biked home, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely lift my bike up the front steps. I went inside and locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt across with trembling fingers. I leaned my bike against the wall and stood there in the dark living room, listening to my own breathing. My chest still felt tight, and my eyes burned from the cold air and the adrenaline. I sat on the floor for a while, knees pulled up to my chest, just staring at the door. The quiet of my apartment felt heavy. I didn't even turn on the lights. After a while, I took a hot shower, letting the water run over me until my hands stopped shaking. I was pushing close to 90 miles an hour westbound on I-70 through Colorado that afternoon. It was early spring, still patches of snow and shadowed spots along the canyon walls, but the sun was out strong enough to keep the road dry. The lane markings were worn from winter chains, but still visible in the glare. I had been driving for hours by then, coming down from Denver and heading towards Utah for a work meeting. My rental car smelled faintly of stale coffee from the drive-through cup I'd finished hours earlier, and my back was sore from sitting. I'd rolled down the window earlier, letting cold air blast in to keep me alert, but now I had it cracked just enough to hear the whoosh of wind without freezing myself out. I remember feeling calm, not tired, but with that mild dull ache in my shoulders from staying tensed and locked into the drive for so long. Somewhere near Glenwood Canyon, I decided to slow down a little. There was barely any traffic, and the sun was starting to drop low, giving the entire canyon this deep golden glow. The river ran fast and white below the bridge, and you could see where it had carved smooth channels out of the solid rock, thousands of years of persistence making a clean cut through a mountain. I eased off the gas, letting myself coast down closer to the speed limit, just enjoying the sheer walls rising around me. Part of me wished I could pull off at one of those rest areas built onto the canyon side to stretch my legs and take a picture of the view, but I had at least 2 more hours of driving to get to my hotel before dark. It was just after I'd slowed down that I saw the state patrol car ahead of me. It was parked on the shoulder up ahead with its lights off. Nothing dramatic, just sitting there like any normal patrol unit waiting for a speeder or a stranded car. As I approached, I saw it turn on its lights, blue and red bouncing off the canyon walls in flickering flashes. I felt my chest drop a little, thinking I'd been clocked going too fast just moments before. That sickening little tingle in my neck as my heart rate picked up. I took my foot off the gas completely, letting the car slow down on its own, and checked my rearview mirror half, expecting another patrol unit to be sneaking up behind me. But the trooper wasn't after me. I watched as he pulled forward and off the lane to the shoulder, where there was an older sedan with its hazard lights blinking. He pulled in behind it, sirens still flashing, no rush, just procedure. I slowed down even more as I passed them, rubbernecking without meaning to. The broken-down car looked beaten up, faded silver, paint rusting around the wheel wells. Its back window had a cracked corner taped over with clear packing tape that had browned in the sun. The driver was sitting in his seat with the door closed, head hanging low, almost like he was asleep or texting. His posture seemed off. Not just tired, but defeated, like his shoulders were sagging under invisible weight. I remember thinking how lucky he was to get help out there, because there were still dead zones with no cell service in the canyon, especially if you weren't with the right carrier. Getting stranded out there would be terrifying with night coming on. The sun drops early in those steep canyons, and temperatures fall fast. I drove past them thinking maybe I should have stopped if the trooper hadn't already been there, but I pushed the thought away. There's always that risk if you stop for a stranger. A couple miles later, the canyon widened, and I settled back into my seat. The mountains ahead looked sharp and purple in the evening light. I turned up the radio to break the silence. Static from the canyon walls fuzzed in and out of the songs, but it didn't bother me. I kept driving west, thinking about dinner, thinking about getting to the hotel in time to take a hot shower, wondering if I should call my boss to check in before tomorrow's meeting. Nothing felt urgent, just the steady rhythm of tires rolling over asphalt seams. I'd been driving for about 10 minutes, maybe 15, when I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. Red and blue bouncing in the dim canyon shadows. I shifted over to the right lane, thinking it was a single patrol car passing someone up ahead. But then I saw another unit flying past me. Then another. Sirens screaming against the stone walls, echoing back so hard it rattled my windows even with them up. My chest tightened with instinctive dread. It's like seeing a tornado off in the distance. You aren't in danger, but your body reacts anyway, heart thudding, blood running cold. They kept coming, one after another, patrol cars flying eastbound back the way I came. Then an ambulance with lights blazing, then 2 fire trucks roaring down the canyon, their engines straining with the climb up the long grade. The sirens came and went in waves, their echoes overlapping in eerie harmonies against the rock. For almost 15 minutes, emergency vehicles kept passing me going east. I counted at least 5 patrol cars, 3 ambulances, and those 2 fire trucks, all of them running hard as if every second counted. That stretch of I-70 isn't a place for big accidents. It's only 2 lanes each way, separated by a thin concrete barrier, with little room for pileups. I wondered if maybe a tour bus had flipped, or a rock slide had crushed a car, or someone's RV had caught fire. The thought made my stomach twist. I kept driving west, still glancing in my rearview mirror for flashing lights that never came. Eventually, the sirens faded behind me, and the road felt quiet again. I drove the rest of the way into Utah in a kind of fog, uneasy but trying to push it away by focusing on the road, the next gas station, the next cup of coffee. I checked into my hotel just before dark. It was one of those budget places with peeling paint on the metal railings and stained carpets that smelled faintly of bleach. The woman at the counter looked tired but kind, and I made small talk about the cold wind while she ran my card and handed me a room key. I took my bag upstairs, let myself into the stale-smelling room, dropped onto the stiff mattress, and just lay there staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles above me. After a while, I got up and turned on the TV to fill the silence. It was set to a local Utah news channel, and they were doing a piece on a fundraiser pancake breakfast at some church. I flipped to another station, and there it was, breaking news from Colorado. The anchor's voice was flat, but tight with emotion. I sat on the end of the bed listening as they replayed the story over and over in different segments. The motorist I'd seen broken down on the side of the road wasn't just someone with engine trouble. Turns out he was wanted. He'd skipped bail on felony charges and was on the run. When the trooper pulled over to help him, he approached like normal, probably asking if he needed a tow or if he had a phone to call someone. The motorist didn't answer. According to the report, he just sat there with his head down. Then he opened his door and got out slowly. The trooper probably thought he was just stepping out to talk. But then the guy pulled out a gun and shot the officer in the back multiple times. I sat there staring at the news report, numb. They showed dash cam footage, blurred and edited for public release, but you could still see the movement, the trooper's silhouette approaching, the driver getting out, then sudden flashes and chaos. The anchor explained that on any normal day, that officer would have been alone. It's standard for troopers to drive solo shifts, especially out there where departments are stretched thin across long stretches of highway. But on that day, by sheer luck, the trooper had his partner with him. They were heading to a training session together, which was rare. When the shots rang out, his partner immediately drew his service weapon and fired back, emptying his clip into the motorist before he could finish killing the officer. The attacker died there on the shoulder, crumpled in the gravel next to his car. The trooper went down hard but didn't die. He almost bled out on the side of the highway, but his partner called for backup immediately and started emergency first aid, holding pressure on the wounds until the ambulances arrived. They airlifted him to a hospital in Grand Junction, where he was in critical condition but alive. The newscaster said doctors thought he would survive, though he would need surgeries and months of rehab to recover fully. He was conscious when his family arrived, awake enough to talk, but barely. I turned off the TV and sat in the dim motel room, staring at the patterned carpet with my elbows on my knees. The hum of the small refrigerator rattled through the quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd been. Just minutes earlier, I'd driven past that trooper and the broken-down car, thinking it was nothing more than a routine traffic stop or a simple assist. I'd thought the driver looked slumped, maybe asleep. I wondered if he'd been planning it then. Wondered if he saw me pass and thought about what he was about to do. Wondered if the trooper saw anything in his eyes before it happened, any glimmer of what was coming. It made my skin crawl, thinking how violent and sudden life can flip. How I could have pulled off to offer help too if the trooper hadn't already been there. I pictured myself stepping out of my rental car in my dress shirt and slacks, walking up to the man's window, smiling and asking if he needed to call a tow truck. I imagined what would have happened if he decided I was a threat or a witness and didn't want to leave anyone alive on the roadside. It felt like my ribs were caving in just thinking about it. I lay down on the bed again and stared at the cracks in the ceiling plaster, listening to cars pass outside on the highway. Their tires made a steady whooshing hum in the night, headlights flashing through the thin curtains. Every time I blinked, I saw the trooper's body crumpling to the ground again, over and over, the blurred dash cam footage replaying in my head. I wondered if he'd seen the canyon walls and the golden light that evening like I did. Wondered if he'd admired the view and thought about getting home to his family later, eating dinner, watching TV with his kids, sleeping in his own bed that night. Wondered if he thought it was just another routine stop. I didn't sleep much that night. My dreams kept playing scenes of roads and sirens and gunshots echoing off canyon walls. The next morning, I got up before I had booked this small cabin deep in the northern woods for a week to get away from everything. I was tired of city noise, the constant hum of cars, and people always around me. I wanted quiet. I wanted to wake up to the smell of pine and the cold morning air slipping through a cracked window. I wanted to sit on the porch and watch the fog drift away from the trees like ghosts in the dawn. I wanted to hear nothing but wind and my own breath. The cabin itself was small, built from old logs that had gone dark over time, almost black in some spots, with streaks of gray where rain ran down the wood. It had a slanted metal roof that clicked and popped as it heated under the sun and cooled at night. The front had a narrow porch with a railing that was missing a few posts, and the wooden steps creaked when I put my weight on them. The door was stiff on its hinges. Inside, the main room was just one open space with a wood stove against the far wall, an old table and 2 chairs to the left, and a bed to the right under a small window. The floorboards were uneven in spots, and some groaned when I walked over them. There was a bathroom attached, with just a toilet and a rusty sink, no shower. The cabin had no electricity, no running hot water, and I had brought bottled water and canned food, plus a camping stove to cook simple meals. My first 2 days were peaceful. I spent hours sitting on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, sipping coffee that I made over the little camping stove. I watched the sun rise and set through the trees. At night, I lit a lantern and read books or just sat staring at the flame, listening to insects chirping and the trees shifting in the wind. The nights were cold, and I slept curled up in my sleeping bag on top of the bed. I woke up a few times to the sound of coyotes yipping far away or owls hooting softly. The sounds didn't scare me. They made me feel like I was really away from everything. On the 3rd day, I woke up before dawn, made coffee, and decided to go for a long walk through the woods. There were no trails here, just dense pine and spruce trees with soft brown needles covering the ground. I stepped over fallen logs and ducked under low branches. Birds were starting to sing, and the light coming through the trees was dim and blue-gray. I walked for what felt like an hour, listening to my boots crunch on the needles, stopping sometimes to lean against a tree and just breathe in the cold morning air. When I turned around to head back, I realized I had wandered farther than I meant to. I couldn't see the cabin, or even the small clearing around it. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I knew roughly which direction I had come from. I started walking that way, glancing at the position of the sun rising through the trees. After another half hour, I finally saw the dark roof of the cabin through the branches, and relief spread through my chest. When I stepped out of the trees and saw the porch and the little clearing around it, I let out a long breath and walked up the steps. That afternoon, I spent some time chopping small logs into kindling and stacking them neatly beside the wood stove. My hands were rough and sore by the time I finished, but it felt good to do something physical, something that kept my mind focused. Later, I sat at the old table eating a can of beans with some crackers, listening to the wind pick up outside. The trees rustled and shifted, and I could hear the metal roof starting to creak. I lit my lantern early that evening because the sky turned dark with heavy clouds. It felt like rain was coming. Around dusk, the rain started tapping on the roof, slow at first, then faster and heavier. I sat in my chair by the window, watching it streak down the glass. That night, the rain kept falling, drumming steadily on the roof. The sound made it hard to sleep, but it also felt comforting in a way, like a blanket wrapping around the cabin, blocking out the rest of the world. I dozed off and woke up a few times, turning over in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain and the wind sighing through the trees. In the middle of the night, I woke up again. It was still raining, but softer now, a steady tapping on the roof and dripping from the eaves outside. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard something different. A crunching sound. Slow, heavy steps on the gravel path outside. The porch steps creaked. My heart started beating fast. I held my breath, straining to hear through the rain. Another creak. Then silence. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a bear sniffing around for food. I hadn't left anything outside, though. I kept listening, feeling my pulse thumping in my throat. After a long minute, I heard nothing but rain again. I stayed awake for a long time, staring into the dark, waiting for another sound. Eventually, I drifted off again. In the morning, it was still raining, but only lightly. The air felt damp and cold when I got up and pulled on my boots. I stepped out onto the porch to look around. The clearing was empty, just wet grass and dripping branches. I walked down the steps and around the cabin, scanning the ground. Near the bottom step, I saw footprints in the mud. They were boot prints, not animal tracks. They led up to the steps and then turned to the side of the cabin, disappearing into the trees. My chest tightened when I saw them. They weren't my prints. They were larger, wider, and the tread was different from my boots. I stood there in the cold rain for a long time, staring at them. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone hiking who saw the cabin and came to check it out. I tried to calm myself with those thoughts, but the idea of someone walking around here in the middle of the night, in the rain, didn't sit right with me. I spent most of that day inside. I kept looking out the windows every few minutes, scanning the trees, feeling uneasy. I kept the lantern close even during the day because the sky was dark and overcast. That night, I put the hatchet I used for chopping kindling beside the bed. I lay there in my sleeping bag with my ears straining for any sound beyond the rain and wind. Every creak of the roof and groan of the wood felt louder, sharper. My muscles were tense. I barely slept. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The air felt heavy and quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I walked around the cabin again, checking the ground. The footprints were still there from the night before, but I didn't see any new ones. I spent that day gathering more wood and stacking it, keeping myself busy. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. Every time the wind blew, I felt a chill down my back. Around noon, I heard something in the trees, branches snapping softly. I froze, staring into the dense pine trunks. The sound stopped. I waited, listening hard, but didn't hear it again. I went back inside and locked the door, even though the lock was just a small metal latch that wouldn't keep anyone determined out. That evening, I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the sun go down through the trees. The sky turned gold and then deep orange before fading to dark blue. The wind picked up again, making the trees sway and rustle like whispers all around me. I went inside before it got fully dark and lit the lantern. I sat at the table, staring at the flickering light on the old wood. My chest felt tight. I didn't want to be here anymore. The silence that had felt peaceful before now felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. That night, I lay in bed with the hatchet beside me again. The wind gusted outside, rattling the metal roof. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my breathing. Then I heard the porch steps creak again. My eyes snapped open. My heart started pounding, so hard I felt it in my neck. Another creak. Slow, heavy. Then silence. I lay there in the dark, gripping the handle of the hatchet, staring at the ceiling. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After a minute, I heard the steps creak again, but this time they were moving away. Then nothing but wind and the sighing of trees. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there until dawn, my muscles cramped and aching from staying so still. When morning finally came, I got up and packed my things quickly. I didn't eat breakfast. I shoved my clothes and food into my bag, stuffed the sleeping bag in, and picked up the hatchet. I stepped out onto the porch and scanned the clearing. I saw fresh footprints in the damp dirt again, leading from the steps into the trees. I followed them with my eyes, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I walked quickly down the path that led back to where I had parked my car half a mile away, hidden behind some trees near an old dirt road. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked, gripping the hatchet in my hand, feeling the weight of it pulling at my arm. My chest felt tight with every step, and the trees felt like they were pressing in closer, dark and endless. When I reached my car, I threw my bag into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the steering wheel. Then I started the engine and drove away down the bumpy dirt road, not looking back. Even after I reached the main highway and the trees fell away into fields and towns, I felt that tightness in my chest. I felt like I was still being watched, still being followed by something quiet and patient that waited for dark and rain and silence. When I got home, I took the hatchet out of my bag and set it on the kitchen table. I sat down and stared at it for a long time. The metal was dull and nicked from chopping wood, but it felt heavier now, like it carried something with it from those nights in the cabin. I never went back there again. I still think about it sometimes, lying awake in my own bed, listening to the quiet hum of my apartment building, thinking about those footsteps on the porch in the dark and the footprints leading away into the trees. I wonder who it was or what they wanted, but I know I will never find out, and I don't want to. All I know is that I left that cabin with a deep cold in my chest. I woke up before sunrise that morning. The air felt heavy in my small room, and I knew I needed to get out for the day. I packed my old backpack with 2 bottles of water, some leftover flatbread, and a packet of salted peanuts I'd kept on the kitchen shelf for weeks. My plan was to go on a long walk to clear my mind, away from traffic, away from work stress, away from the stale smell of my apartment. I left the house just as the horizon turned gray-blue. There were no cars on the road yet. The stray dogs were still curled up near the tea stall at the corner, and the fruit sellers hadn't arrived. I walked fast, my worn sneakers slapping against the empty footpath, until I reached the side road that led out of town. From there, I headed towards the fields and the small forest reserve that ran alongside the railway line. The sun rose slowly as I walked through the open fields. Dew clung to the grass, soaking my shoes and cooling my feet. Birds woke up and started calling out to each other across the trees. The railway line was empty and silent. I crossed it and kept going until I entered the forest reserve. It was a small stretch of trees and undergrowth, nothing like a real forest, but enough to make you feel alone and hidden from the world. I followed the faint trail into the trees, brushing past spiderwebs stretched between low branches. The morning air smelled of damp soil and old leaves. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of a bird landing on a branch or the dry rattle of leaves falling to the ground. The further I went, the dimmer the light became as the trees grew taller and thicker. I walked for about an hour before stopping on a flat rock next to a small clearing. I took off my backpack, stretched my legs, and sat down to eat. I tore the flatbread into pieces and chewed slowly, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the soft rustle of wind high in the trees. I drank half of my first water bottle, wiped my mouth with my sleeve, and leaned back to stare at the sky through the gaps in the branches. For a while, I didn't think about anything. My mind felt empty and calm. After finishing the peanuts, I packed up again and continued deeper into the forest reserve. The trail became fainter the further I went, with dry leaves and fallen twigs covering the ground so that I had to watch every step. I saw animal tracks in the mud near a dried-up stream, probably a stray dog or maybe a jackal. The smell of damp earth was stronger there. I bent down and touched the tracks. They were fresh. I stood up and kept walking, listening to the distant hum of a train passing somewhere far behind me. The trail soon disappeared completely. I looked around and realized I was surrounded by trees in every direction. I could still hear the train faintly, so I knew which way was back towards the railway line. But instead of turning back, I decided to keep going straight. I thought it would eventually lead to the boundary wall at the other end of the reserve. I felt curious about how far the trees stretched. I wanted to reach the far edge. The trees here were older, with trunks thick as water tanks and roots that snaked out of the ground in sharp bends. There were thorny bushes between them, forcing me to slow down and push them aside carefully to avoid scratching my legs. My shoes were covered in dry leaves and reddish soil. Sweat rolled down my back, soaking the waistband of my pants. Small flies buzzed around my ears. I kept swatting them away and wiping my forehead with my wrist. I don't know how long I walked. The shadows moved as the sun climbed higher, making everything look different each time I paused to check my surroundings. After a while, I noticed that the forest floor was sloping gently downwards. It felt cooler there, and the soil under my feet turned damp. I saw more animal tracks, deeper this time, and long claw marks in the mud near a tree. I stopped and looked at them for a while. They looked too big for a dog, almost like a leopard's. My chest tightened a little, and I scanned the trees around me, but I saw nothing moving. I told myself it was probably just an old mark or a big stray dog scraping the ground. I kept moving, but slower this time, listening to every small sound. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears. The air smelled different here, sharper and mixed with a faint rotting smell that made me breathe through my mouth. There were no bird calls anymore. The forest felt silent, like it was holding its breath. I stepped over a fallen branch and froze. In front of me was a dead animal. It looked like a deer, its body half-eaten and rotting in the damp soil. Flies covered its open belly, and the smell hit me so hard I almost gagged. Its neck was twisted at a strange angle, and its eyes were gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. I realized the claw marks I saw earlier were real. Something big was here, and it had eaten recently. My body felt light and hollow. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, trying to follow my footprints and broken branches. Every sound made me jerk my head around. My mouth felt dry, and I could feel my pulse in my temples. The walk back felt longer than the walk in. I couldn't find the trail I came from. Every tree looked the same. I kept changing direction, trying to find familiar marks, but everything looked unfamiliar in the harsh light of noon. At some point, I stopped to drink water and calm myself. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the bottle. I sat down on a fallen log, breathing hard, trying to think clearly. I remembered the sun's position from earlier and tried to keep it on my left, hoping it would lead me back towards the railway line. I started walking again, faster this time, stepping hard to make noise in case an animal was nearby. The forest seemed endless. Sweat ran down my back and chest, soaking my shirt completely. My legs felt heavy, and my shoes were wet with mud from the damp patches I kept stepping into. The flies were everywhere, landing on my face, buzzing around my eyes and mouth. I wiped them away again and again, feeling my skin burn with irritation. After what felt like hours, I saw a tall termite mound near a tree with a split trunk. I remembered passing it earlier. Relief washed over me. I adjusted my direction to the right and kept moving, hoping to cross the trail I originally entered from. My throat hurt from thirst. I drank the last of my water, feeling the plastic bottle crumple as I squeezed out the last drops. The light started to change again. I realized it was past noon and heading towards late afternoon. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the forest floor. My feet hurt with every step. My stomach felt hollow and cramped with hunger. I reached into my backpack for anything to eat, but it was empty except for the peanut wrapper. I kept walking, driven by fear and desperation. My mind started drifting into dull confusion. The trees blurred together, and my feet moved without thought. I stumbled over a root and fell hard on my knee. Pain shot up my leg, and I yelled out, but the forest swallowed my voice. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the ground. I felt tears gather in my eyes, but I blinked them away. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the sharp pain in my knee, and started moving again. Finally, just as the light was turning orange, I saw a thin line of open space between the trees ahead. I limped towards it as fast as I could. I broke through the last of the undergrowth and found myself at the railway line. Relief flooded through me so hard my knees almost gave out. I bent over, breathing fast, staring at the gravel under my feet. My hands were covered in dirt and dried blood from scratches on my arms. My legs shook with exhaustion. I turned and looked back at the forest. It looked peaceful from the outside, bathed in the soft orange light of sunset, with birds calling to each other again. It was hard to believe how terrifying it felt inside, like another world hidden behind the trees. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, then turned and started walking along the railway line back towards town. My knee hurt with every step, but I ignored it. I just kept thinking about home, about lying down on my mattress and drinking cold water from the fridge. The walk back felt endless, but I didn't care. I was out. I kept glancing back over my shoulder at the forest, half expecting to see something stalking me along the tree line, but there was nothing. By the time I reached the main road, the sun had almost set. The first few streetlights flickered on, casting pale yellow circles on the ground. Cars were on the road now, honking and weaving past each other. I felt the tension drain out of me as I stepped onto the footpath and saw people again. An old man sitting at the tea stall, a boy pushing a cart full of mangoes, two women talking outside their gate. The smell of diesel fumes and fried food felt comforting after the sharp, rotting smell of the forest. I limped the rest of the way home. My knee was swollen, and every step sent pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't care. I reached my apartment building, climbed the stairs slowly, and unlocked my door. I walked straight to the kitchen, filled a steel glass with cold water, and drank it in one long swallow. Then I washed my face, cleaned the dirt from my arms and legs, and sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall. I stared at the closed door for a long time, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the ceiling fan humming above me. My body felt drained, empty, and light at the same time. The forest felt far away, almost like a dream, but my scraped arms and bruised knee told me it was real. I sat there until the sky outside turned black, and the streetlights glowed through the window bars. That night, I lay on my mattress, staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about the claw marks in the mud and the half-eaten deer. I thought about how silent the forest became after I saw it. I realized how close I was to something dangerous without even knowing it at first. The thought made I had been feeling burnout for weeks. Work was piling up, and every day felt the same. Wake up, go to the office, come home late, heat up dinner, fall asleep on the couch with the TV still playing. When my cousin told me he knew someone renting out a cabin in the woods for cheap, I jumped at it. He said it was about a 4-hour drive from the city, way up in the northern hills, surrounded by pine forests and quiet valleys, no neighbors for miles. Just what I needed. I booked it for 5 nights, starting on a Wednesday. I figured if I left early enough, I could beat traffic and get there by lunch. I packed light. Just some basic clothes, my hiking boots, canned food, water, instant coffee, a small gas stove, my sleeping bag, and my old hunting knife just in case. I didn't own a gun, never felt like I needed one, but the knife always felt comforting when I was alone outdoors. The drive up was peaceful. The highway cut through flat farmlands at first, then rose into winding forest roads. I had the windows down, and the cool morning breeze smelled like pine and earth. By the time I turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun was climbing higher and warming everything up. The road was narrow, just 2 tire tracks carved into the grass with wildflowers growing along the edges. I slowed down, careful of the rocks. Tall pines crowded in close. I saw squirrels darting across fallen logs, small birds hopping along the branches. The deeper I drove, the darker it felt under the trees. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I expected. Just a simple wooden structure with a pitched tin roof, a single window on the front, and a door with peeling green paint. There was a narrow porch with 2 old chairs and a tiny table. The clearing itself was ringed with trees so thick I couldn't see beyond them, just dark trunks and swaying branches. The ground was covered in pine needles, cones, and small tufts of grass. I parked to the side and stepped out, stretching my back after the drive. The place was silent except for the gentle wind and a few distant crows calling out. I walked around the cabin first, checking it out. The back had a small shed, locked with a rusty padlock. Next to it was a big metal drum half buried in the ground, probably used for burning trash. There was a small woodpile under a slanted overhang, but it looked damp and old. On the other side of the cabin, someone had set up a rough stone fire pit with a ring of logs to sit on. The ashes inside were cold and scattered, with old cigarette butts mixed in. I felt relieved seeing signs that people had been here recently. It made me feel less alone. I unlocked the cabin door with the key left for me under the porch chair. The inside was dark and cool. There was a single room with a small kitchen counter along one wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a twin bed with a thin mattress pushed up under the window. Dust floated in the light beams sneaking through the cracks in the window frame. The air smelled musty like old wood and stale air. I opened the window wide to let fresh breeze flow through. There was no electricity, only a single gas lantern sitting on the table. I unpacked my bag, rolled out my sleeping bag on the mattress, set up my stove near the window for ventilation. and poured myself some cold water to drink. Sitting there in the quiet cabin, listening to the breeze outside and feeling the cool wood under my bare feet, I felt my shoulders finally relax. The first day passed peacefully. I explored the woods behind the cabin, following deer trails and stepping over mossy fallen logs. I found a small creek trickling over rocks about half a mile away. The water was so clear I could see tiny fish darting under the stones. I sat on the bank and watched them for a long time, not thinking about work or emails or anything, just listening to birds and the quiet bubbling of the water. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, gathered some fallen sticks, and tried to build a fire in the pit outside. The wood was too damp, so I gave up and cooked canned beans on my gas stove instead. That night I sat on the porch in the dark, the lantern casting a small circle of light around me, and watched the stars come out one by one until the whole sky was filled with them. The forest was silent except for occasional rustling from animals moving through the undergrowth. At some point I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep listening to the faint breeze moving through the trees. The next morning I woke up before dawn. It was freezing cold. My breath came out in small clouds and my toes felt numb. I pulled on my boots and coat and stepped outside to stretch. The sky was still dark, but starting to lighten at the edges. I walked a little way into the trees to relieve myself. The forest felt completely still, almost like it was holding its breath before sunrise. As I stood there, I suddenly felt like I was being watched. The feeling hit me hard, making the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I looked around but saw nothing, just the dark shapes of trees and a faint outline of the cabin through the trunks. I shook off the feeling, finished up, and hurried back to the porch. That day I decided to hike further out. I packed some snacks and water and followed a deer trail north. The trees were so thick in places I had to duck under low branches and step over tangles of fallen limbs. Squirrels barked at me from above. At one point, I startled a small group of wild turkeys that exploded out of the underbrush with a flurry of wings and sharp clucking. I laughed out loud, my heart pounding. I kept going until I reached a rocky outcrop that gave a clear view over the forest valley below. I could see the tops of pine trees stretching for miles in every direction. No roads, no cabins, no towers, nothing but green and blue and the pale summer sky. I sat there for an hour eating crackers and drinking water, listening to the wind moving through the trees below me. When I hiked back to the cabin later that afternoon, the shadows were already growing long. The woods felt cooler and darker. I walked a little faster, feeling that strange sensation again, like I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, but saw nothing. When I reached the clearing and saw the cabin through the trees, I felt a deep relief. I stepped onto the porch and kicked my boots against the railing to knock the dirt off. That evening I boiled noodles on my stove, ate them sitting on the porch, and watched the sun set behind the trees. The air turned cold quickly. I bundled up in my coat, holding my knees against my chest, feeling small and content. That night I woke up to a noise. It was pitch black inside the cabin, the lantern long burned out. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a slow crunching sound from outside, like footsteps moving across the pine needles. My eyes were wide open in the dark. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shaky. I stayed completely still, listening. The crunching stopped for a while, then started again, closer to the window this time. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I tried to calm my breathing so I could hear better. The steps moved around to the side of the cabin, then stopped again. I waited for what felt like forever, straining my ears. Finally, I heard them move away towards the trees, fading into silence. I lay awake for hours after that, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to every creak and rustle. My mind ran through possibilities. A bear maybe, or a deer. Could it have been a person? The thought made my stomach tighten with fear. Who would be walking around out here in the middle of the night? Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep, but I woke up feeling heavy and tense. The morning sun felt like a relief. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around the clearing. The pine needles were disturbed in a rough path, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin and back again. Big, heavy indentations. I crouched down to look at them. They weren't hoof marks. They looked like boot prints. All day I felt on edge. I tried to hike again, but my mind kept jumping back to the noises and the prints. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone following me through the trees. By afternoon, I was so anxious, I just went back to the cabin and sat on the porch, watching the woods. I thought about leaving early, but it felt stupid. Maybe it was just a hunter passing through at night, though the idea of someone with a gun walking around my cabin didn't feel comforting either. I ate dinner without really tasting it, cleaned up my little stove and pot, and locked the cabin door tight before getting into my sleeping bag. I kept the knife right next to me. I lay there in the dark listening. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the trees outside, every gust of wind scraping a branch against the wall made my body tense. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I dreamed of walking through endless woods with no path and no sky, just trees and darkness. I woke up just before dawn, heart pounding, sweaty and cold. That day I didn't go anywhere. I stayed on the porch with my knife, watching the trees, listening to every sound. Birds came and went. A squirrel chattered angrily at me for sitting too close to its tree. The day felt like it dragged on forever. I tried reading an old magazine I found in the cabin, but couldn't focus. As the sun started setting, I gathered fallen sticks and lit a fire in the stone pit. I kept the fire going for hours, feeding it every few minutes. The light and smoke felt like protection. I sat with my back to the cabin wall, knife in my lap, staring out into the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees stood there, silent and unmoving. Around midnight, the fire was dying down to glowing coals. I was fighting sleep, my eyelids heavy. That's when I heard it again. Crunching steps, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees. I felt a cold sweat break out down my neck. I gripped the knife tighter and stayed completely still. The steps came closer, stopping just at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything beyond the dying light of the coals. My eyes strained against the darkness. I woke up before dawn that morning, around 4:30. I hadn't really slept much during the night because of the heat inside my small rented room. The ceiling fan above my bed just moved the warm air around instead of cooling me down. By the time the alarm buzzed on my phone, I was already awake, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the low hum of traffic outside and the occasional barking of stray dogs echoing through the empty streets. I rolled out of bed slowly, feeling the stiffness in my back from sleeping on the old mattress. My legs felt heavy when I stood up, but I stretched them out a little before grabbing my running shoes from under the bed. The sun wasn't up yet, but I could see a faint blue light gathering outside my window. I didn't switch on the light in the room. I liked leaving in the dark, like I was sneaking away before the world woke up. I tied my shoes tightly, double knotting the laces so they wouldn't come undone while I was running. My shirt felt damp with sweat even before I stepped outside. I grabbed my phone and earphones and slipped out into the corridor, careful not to let the door slam behind me. The hallway smelled of cement dust and stale water from the leaking pipes that ran along the ceiling. I walked down the 2 flights of stairs quickly, feeling a small excitement in my chest as I stepped out into the dawn. Outside, the air was warm and smelled like diesel fumes mixed with rotting trash. I could hear crows calling from somewhere in the distance. I put my earphones in and started jogging slowly towards the main road. There were only a few cars passing at that time, headlights sweeping across the wet patches on the asphalt from where people had thrown water out to settle the dust. The shop shutters were down, but I could see tea sellers setting up their carts, lighting small fires under metal pots. I didn't want to run along the main road that morning. I had been planning to run along the canal trail instead. It was about 3 kilometers away from my house, a narrow dirt path that ran along the irrigation canal, cutting through the farms outside the city. It was quieter there, away from honking bikes and stray dogs fighting over garbage piles. I jogged towards it, keeping my pace slow until I got to the end of the residential blocks. The road turned into a rough dirt track after a while. I passed some early morning vegetable sellers pushing their carts towards the city market. A few of them glanced at me as I passed, but most didn't even notice. My feet kicked up small clouds of dust as I ran past them, the smell of fresh coriander and wet jute bags hitting my nose for a second before disappearing behind me. After about 30 minutes, I reached the start of the canal trail. The canal itself wasn't very wide, maybe 20 feet across, with low concrete walls on both sides. The water was murky and brown, moving slowly with bits of plastic floating on top. The trail ran alongside it for nearly 15 kilometers before disappearing into farmlands. I usually only ran about 5 kilometers in, then turned around to head back home. I picked up my pace a little as I started along the trail. There were small trees growing along the edge, casting faint shadows onto the dirt path. Birds were waking up in them, their chirping blending into the steady thump of my feet hitting the ground. I tried to focus on my breathing, inhaling through my nose and out through my mouth in rhythm with each step. After about 20 minutes of running, I noticed the sun starting to rise behind me. The light hit the fields on the other side of the canal, making the green leaves glow in a soft yellow hue. A cool breeze blew across the water for a moment, drying some of the sweat on my face. I felt good then, like I could run forever if I wanted to. The trail started to narrow after that, with bushes growing out onto the path in places. I had to slow down to avoid scratching my arms. The canal wall was broken in one spot where it looked like someone had driven a tractor too close and the concrete had crumbled away. There was a gap there where the earth had collapsed into the water, leaving only a narrow edge to pass. I stopped running and walked across it carefully, feeling my shoes sink slightly into the loose soil. When I got across, I started running again, picking up my pace as I entered the denser part of the trail. It was quieter there. I could only hear my own breathing and the sound of my feet against the dirt. The bushes and small trees grew thick on both sides, blocking the view of the fields. There were spider webs across the path in some places, thin strands catching on my face as I ran through them. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, feeling a small shiver each time. After another 10 minutes, I saw something ahead of me that made me slow down. There was a small motorbike lying on its side at the edge of the path. The front wheel was half buried in the dry mud, and one of the mirrors was broken off, lying a few feet away. I looked around, but didn't see anyone nearby. The bushes on both sides were still, no movement at all. I walked closer to it, pulling my earphones out so I could listen for any sounds. The motorbike looked old and rusted in places. The seat was torn, and the foam was showing through. I could see footprints in the dirt around it, some going into the bushes on the side of the trail. They were deep prints, like someone had walked there in a hurry. I felt a tightness in my chest as I stood there, looking at those footprints disappearing into the dense bushes. For a moment, I thought of just turning around and running back home, but my curiosity pulled me closer to the bushes. I stepped off the trail and pushed the branches aside, peering into the undergrowth. The ground sloped down towards the canal, and there were more footprints leading down, bending some of the grass flat. I started walking slowly down the slope, careful not to slip. The ground was damp closer to the water, and my shoes sank into the mud with a sucking sound. I could smell the stale water of the canal mixed with rotting vegetation. I kept following the footprints until I reached a small clearing right next to the water. There was a blue tarpaulin spread on the ground there, held down by rocks on the corners. On top of it, I saw a pile of clothes and a small black bag lying open, with a few things scattered around it. There was a plastic bottle of water, half empty, and some packets of biscuits. Everything looked like someone had been staying there for at least a few days. I looked around again, but didn't see anyone. The bushes on the other side of the canal were dense and still. I felt uneasy standing there, like I was trespassing on someone's hidden place. I turned around to walk back up to the trail, but then I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was a low rustling from the bushes behind the tarp, followed by the faint sound of someone's breathing. My heart started beating, so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move for a few seconds, just listening to that breathing. It was slow and heavy, like whoever was there was trying not to make any noise. I took a step back, and the mud squelched under my shoe. The breathing stopped for a moment, and then I heard a sudden flurry of movement as someone shifted behind the bushes. I turned and ran up the slope as fast as I could, branches scratching against my arms and face. My foot slipped on the damp soil, and I fell forward, hitting my knee against a rock. Pain shot up my leg, but I pushed myself up and kept running until I reached the trail. My chest was heaving, and my knee was throbbing with pain. I glanced back down towards the clearing, but I couldn't see anything through the bushes. I didn't wait any longer. I started running back along the trail, my heart racing so fast it felt like it would burst. I kept looking over my shoulder as I ran, expecting to see someone chasing after me. The trees and bushes blurred past me as I sprinted along the path, my breathing ragged and shallow. The pain in my knee made my leg feel weak, but I forced myself to keep going. When I reached the broken section of the canal wall, I nearly slipped again as I crossed it. My shoe skidded on the loose soil, sending a few small rocks tumbling into the water below. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the wider part of the trail closer to the city. There, I slowed down and bent over, clutching my knees as I tried to catch my breath. My whole body was shaking, and sweat was dripping from my face onto the dirt below. I stood there for a long time, listening to the morning sounds around me. The birds calling, the distant sound of traffic, and the faint breeze rustling through the leaves. I didn't hear any footsteps following me, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave my chest. I straightened up and started walking towards home, limping slightly from the pain in my knee. The rest of the walk back was a blur. I kept looking behind me every few minutes, half expecting to see someone walking along the trail, but it remained empty. By the time I reached the paved road leading into the city, the sun was fully up, and the streets were getting crowded. People walked past me carrying their vegetable bags, bikes weaved through traffic, and street dogs lay curled up in the shade. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake off the feeling from my chest. When I reached my apartment building, I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the ache in my knee with each step. I unlocked my room and went inside, shutting the door behind me and locking it twice. I leaned against it for a moment, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan above me, trying to calm my racing heart. Later that day, I thought about what I had seen. I wondered who that person was hiding in the bushes, why they left their bike on the trail, and what they were doing out there so early in the morning. Part of me wanted to go back the next day to check if the tarp and bag were still there, but another part of me knew I wouldn't. There was something about that place, about the silent breathing hidden in the bushes, that made my skin crawl every time I thought about it. I never ran along that canal trail again after that day. I stuck to the main roads after sunrise, staying where there were people and traffic and noise. Even now, whenever I think about that morning, I can still hear the faint breathing coming from the bushes, hidden just out of sight, waiting for me to get close. And I'm glad I woke up early that morning, before the sun had even started to lighten the sky. My eyes were heavy with sleep, but I forced myself to get up because I had been planning this solo hike for over a week. I wanted to do something to clear my head from all the clutter it had collected lately. Work had been stressful, life felt dull, and everything seemed like it was on repeat. Wake up, eat, work, come back home, sleep, repeat. So, I thought going out into nature alone might help me feel alive again. I packed everything I needed the night before. There was a half loaf of bread, a can of tuna, some peanut butter, an apple, a small bag of salted peanuts, and 2 big bottles of water. I didn't think I would need much more since I planned on returning by night. I also packed a flashlight with extra batteries, my old camping knife, my phone fully charged, and my small first aid pouch that I always kept ready. I dressed in my black sweatpants and gray hoodie, pulled on my thick socks and my boots, and left the house just as the faint orange line appeared in the eastern sky. The trailhead was a 40-minute drive from my house. I parked in the empty gravel lot, locked my car, and started walking towards the small wooden sign that marked the beginning of the trail. The air was cold, with dew soaking the tips of the grass. I could smell the damp soil and rotting leaves, but I liked it. The trees were tall, old pines mostly, mixed with some oaks and maples, and their dark shapes made the trail feel like a tunnel. I walked for almost 2 hours without stopping. The sun rose fully during that time, sending beams of gold through the branches, lighting up the mist that curled on the forest floor. I felt good. My legs burned a bit from the steady climb, but my chest felt open and calm. Every now and then I heard birds calling from high up, or squirrels chasing each other around tree trunks. The forest was alive with small sounds, and my mind felt quiet for the first time in weeks. After about 2 hours, I found a large flat rock beside the trail where I sat down to eat some peanuts and drink water. I didn't rest long because I wanted to reach the ridgeline before noon. I stood up, stretched my back, and continued climbing. The trail eventually stopped climbing and leveled out into a wide ridge. The trees here were thinner, so I could see far down into the valleys on both sides. On my left, I could see the tops of trees stretching into the distance like a green ocean. On my right, the ground dropped steeply into a narrow valley where I could see part of a small stream flashing silver in the sun. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures. There was no signal, but I kept it in my pocket just in case. I walked along that ridge for a while. The path turned narrow, hugging the slope closely. I moved carefully, placing each step with purpose because slipping here would mean tumbling down into rocks and trees. I felt a small rush of fear, but it wasn't unpleasant. It reminded me I was alive. After a while, the trail turned away from the ridgeline and descended gently into thicker woods. Here the trees grew close together. The sunlight could barely reach the ground, so everything was dim and damp. Moss covered the rocks and fallen logs. It smelled earthy and cool. I started to feel uneasy for no clear reason. There was nothing threatening here, but something about the silence in that deep part of the forest felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing against me. I kept walking. After a few minutes, I noticed the trail was becoming hard to follow. Grass and ferns had grown over parts of it, and old fallen branches lay across it. I wondered if people stopped using this part of the trail. I checked my phone again, but there was still no signal. I tried to remember the route I had seen on the map at the trailhead. I thought this was still the right way, so I kept going. Soon I came to a small clearing. There was an old stone fire ring in the middle, blackened with ash, but it looked like no one had used it in years. Ferns had grown in the cracks between the stones, and some had almost covered the fire pit. I decided to rest here and eat lunch. I sat on a fallen log, opened the can of tuna, and ate it with my bread. The tuna smelled strong, but I didn't mind. I was hungry, and I finished it quickly, washed it down with water, and wiped my hands on a napkin. While I was eating, I noticed the quiet again. There were no birds singing here, no squirrels, not even the sound of insects buzzing. The forest around me was still, as if everything had gone away or was hiding. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I felt like I was being watched, but when I turned around slowly, there was nothing behind me except dark trees and thick undergrowth. I finished eating and stood up. I decided to keep moving so I could loop back to the main trail before evening. The sun was still high, but in the forest it felt like dusk. I walked quickly at first, eager to leave the clearing behind. As I moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing except the crunch of my boots on old leaves and twigs. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise behind me. It was so soft I thought I imagined it at first. I stopped walking and listened hard. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it again, a small crack, like a twig breaking underfoot. I turned around fast. My heart jumped into my throat, but there was nothing there. Only trees, shadows, and patches of dark green ferns. I felt cold all over. My hands shook slightly as I gripped my water bottle tighter. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a branch falling from a tree, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of fear that spread through my chest. I started walking again, but this time I moved faster. I kept looking back over my shoulder every few steps. My breathing felt shallow, and sweat dripped down my neck, even though the forest was cool. After about 10 minutes, I heard another sound behind me. This time it was louder, a rustle, like something moving quickly through the ferns. I turned around so fast that my boots slipped a bit on the damp ground. My eyes scanned the shadows. I saw a slight movement between the trees, like something dark slipping behind a thick pine trunk. My chest tightened. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to keep walking fast instead. I didn't want to run and trigger a chase if it was an animal. I kept walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. My eyes darted to every tree, every bush, every shadow. My ears strained for more sounds. Then, suddenly, I saw something ahead of me on the trail. At first it looked like a big dark lump, but as I got closer, I realized it was a dead deer. It lay on its side, legs stiff, eyes open and glassy. Its belly had been torn open. The fur around the wound was matted dark with dried blood, and flies buzzed around it in lazy circles. The smell hit me like a slap, the thick, sickening rot of death mixed with iron. I gagged and stumbled back a step. My eyes watered from the smell. I looked around quickly. The wound was jagged, not like a clean cut from a hunter's knife. It looked like it had been ripped open. I felt a jolt of fear, so strong it made my knees weak. I didn't want to be here anymore. I stepped around the dead deer, trying not to look at it. My boots sank into the damp soil as I moved off the trail for a bit to pass it. As I walked by, I noticed deep claw marks on the deer's side, for long lines raked through the fur and skin. I felt cold all over again. My brain was trying to figure out what could have done that. A bear maybe, or a mountain lion. But the claw marks seemed too widely spaced for a mountain lion. I kept moving. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt my ribs. Every step felt like it took forever. My mouth was dry, and I kept swallowing. I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the crunch of my boots. I felt exposed and small under the tall trees. The trail twisted left and began to climb again, and I forced myself to keep going. My legs burned with the effort. After what felt like forever, I reached the top of a small rise, and from there I could see the trail winding down towards the valley. I felt a flicker of hope. If I could reach the valley, I could follow the stream back towards the main trail. I started down the slope, moving as quickly as I could without falling. About halfway down, I heard another noise behind me. This time it was not a snap or a rustle. It was a deep, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It sounded wet, like something gurgling low in its throat. I felt my blood turn to ice. I turned around slowly, almost too afraid to look. At first, I saw nothing but trees. Then I saw it. Between two thick pine trunks, about 30 feet behind me, stood a dark shape. I couldn't see it clearly because the shadows were deep there, but it was tall, taller than a man. Broad shoulders, a thick dark shape. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. I felt a wave of panic, so strong I almost vomited. My legs shook, and my vision went blurry at the edges. I turned and ran. My boots slipped on the slope, and I nearly fell, but I caught myself and kept running. Branches whipped my face. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't care about the noise I made anymore. I just needed to get away. I stumbled down the hill, half running, half sliding. My backpack banged against my back with each step. I reached the bottom of the slope and found myself in thick undergrowth. I pushed through bushes and low-hanging branches until I found the stream. I didn't stop to think. I turned left and started running along the bank. The cold water splashed my boots as I ran, soaking my socks, but I didn't care. I ran for what felt like hours. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would collapse. I kept running until I couldn't hear anything behind me except the pounding of my own steps and the roar of blood in my ears. Eventually I had to stop. My chest was heaving, so hard I felt like I might pass out. I bent over. I woke up around 4 in the morning. I wasn't supposed to be up that early. My alarm was set for 6, but I couldn't sleep. I was too warm under the blanket, even though it was cold outside, and my legs felt restless. I kept turning over and over, trying to find a comfortable position, but I couldn't. I finally threw the blanket off me and sat up in bed. I looked at my phone. It was 4:12 a.m. The room was dark except for the streetlight glow coming through the blinds. I got up and walked to the kitchen to drink some water. My small apartment felt even quieter than usual at that hour. No cars driving by. No neighbors moving around. Just complete silence. I poured myself some water and drank it standing near the sink. My throat felt dry and rough, like I hadn't drunk anything in days. I put the glass down and stood there, staring at the window above the sink. It was pitch black outside. I could see my own reflection in the window glass. I felt an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. I didn't know why. I tried to breathe slowly, but it felt like something was off. I turned away from the window and walked back to my bedroom. I sat on my bed for a while, looking at the dark wall. I didn't want to turn the light on. It would just make me more awake, and I wanted to at least try to sleep again. But then I thought maybe I should go outside for a bit. Maybe walk around the parking lot, breathe some cold, fresh air, and come back into sleep before getting ready for work. I put on my sweatpants and my black hoodie. I didn't bother with shoes. I slipped my feet into my old sandals that I always kept by the door and grabbed my keys quietly so they wouldn't jingle too loud. I opened the door slowly. The hallway was dark. The motion sensor lights turned on with a faint buzz. I walked down the hallway to the stairs and went down, each step echoing slightly in the silence. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face immediately. It felt good. It was still so dark. The streetlights didn't reach the back parking lot well. There was just one lamp post flickering near the dumpster. I walked towards the far side of the lot, where there was a little grass patch with a thin tree. I put my hands in my hoodie pockets and breathed in the cold air deeply. My breath came out in white puffs. The silence outside felt different from the silence inside. It felt heavy, like the whole world was asleep except me. I stood there for a while, just staring at the ground. The asphalt was cracked in places. Small weeds were growing out of some cracks. There were a few pieces of broken glass glinting near the curb, probably from an old bottle someone smashed weeks ago. I could smell faint garbage coming from the dumpster, but also the wet dirt smell of the grass beside me. After a few minutes, I turned around to go back inside. I had only taken 2 steps when I heard it. A strange metal scraping noise. It was coming from behind the dumpster. I stopped walking. The sound wasn't loud, but it was clear. It sounded like metal sliding against metal, slowly. I stood completely still, staring at the dumpster. Nothing moved. The flickering light above it made the shadows shift back and forth. I waited, listening hard. Then I heard it again. Metal scraping against metal, with a small thud after it. My chest tightened again. I felt my legs go tense. I told myself it was probably a cat or a raccoon messing with the dumpster lid. I didn't want to check. I turned around quickly and started walking towards the stairs, trying to keep my pace normal, but my heart was beating faster with every step. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard another noise. This time it wasn't metal. It was a faint cough, like a human cough. It came from the direction of the dumpster. My blood went cold. I didn't turn to look. I climbed the stairs fast, but tried not to make stomping sounds. I felt like I was being watched the whole time. I reached my floor, walked down the hall, and opened my apartment door as quietly as I could. I locked it immediately and slid the deadbolt into place. Inside, I stood with my back against the door, breathing hard. My hands were slightly shaking. I felt foolish for getting so scared. It was probably just a homeless person digging through the trash. But then I thought about that cough. It didn't sound like someone clearing their throat. It sounded like someone trying to keep quiet. I shook my head to clear the thought and walked back to my bedroom. I lay down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. My body felt cold now, even under the blanket. I closed my eyes and tried to slow my breathing, but every little creak in the building made me jump. I imagined someone standing out there near the dumpster, looking up at the building, trying to see which window was mine. My heart wouldn't calm down. I turned over to face the wall, squeezing my eyes shut, and eventually fell asleep. I woke up at 6 when my alarm went off. My body felt heavy and exhausted. I got up and made myself coffee, staring at the dark liquid swirling in the mug. The morning felt gray and lifeless. I got dressed for work and left the apartment, looking around cautiously as I locked the door behind me. The hallway felt normal again. The motion sensor lights turned on bright and steady. When I walked outside, the sun was just starting to rise. The sky was light purple and orange. I glanced at the dumpster as I passed it on the way to my car. The area around it was completely empty. The lid was half open, and there was a broken hanger lying on the ground. I didn't see anyone or anything there. I tried to shake off the creepy feeling in my chest as I unlocked my car and got in. On the way to work, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The metal scraping noise, the cough, the silence afterwards. It kept looping in my mind, making my stomach feel tight. Work was normal that day. Everyone talked about the usual things, emails, deadlines, the coming weekend. I answered calls and typed reports, but I felt like I was moving through everything in a daze. When work finished, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while before starting the engine. I didn't feel like going home yet, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I drove back slowly, listening to the soft hum of the tires on the road. When I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I glanced at the dumpster again. It was quiet. The lid was closed now. I parked and sat in my car for a minute with my keys in my hand, staring at the steering wheel. Finally, I forced myself to get out. I walked quickly up the stairs and unlocked my door. Inside, I locked it immediately again. The apartment felt empty but safe. I cooked myself a simple dinner, just boiled eggs and toast. I ate standing in the kitchen, staring at the floor, feeling drained. That night I tried to sleep early. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Every sound from outside made my eyes snap open. I heard cars passing sometimes, or neighbors' doors closing, but nothing unusual. Around midnight, I finally drifted into a light sleep. I woke up again at 3:30 a.m. My eyes opened suddenly. I didn't know why I woke up. I lay still, listening to the silence. My ears felt like they were straining for any noise. Then I heard it again, a faint metal scraping noise. It sounded distant but clear. My heart started beating hard immediately. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate, metal against metal. Then silence. I sat there in the dark, staring at the wall, too scared to move. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? There was a noise outside. That was it. They wouldn't come for that. I sat frozen for what felt like an hour, but when I checked the time, only 10 minutes had passed. My chest felt tight again. I struggled to breathe normally. I sat there, listening to my own heartbeat and the silence around me. Then I heard another noise. This time it wasn't metal. It was a footstep. A slow, deliberate footstep on the gravel outside. Then another, getting closer to the building. My mouth went dry. I didn't want to go to the window, but I felt like I had to see. I got up slowly, trying not to make the floor creak. I stepped closer to the window and moved the blinds just a tiny bit. My eyes searched the darkness outside. At first, I saw nothing. Then I saw a shadow moving near the dumpster. My chest felt like it stopped working. The shadow moved again, and I realized it was a person. A man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. He was dragging something metal along the ground behind him. It looked like a broken metal rod or a long pipe. He walked to the side of the dumpster and stopped. He stood there, completely still, facing the building. I didn't know if he was looking up at me or just staring at the walls. I felt my knees shaking. I wanted to move back from the window, but I was frozen. He stood there for what felt like forever. Then he lifted the metal rod slightly and dragged it slowly along the side of the dumpster again, making that same scraping noise I heard before. I felt my throat close up. I forced myself to step away from the window quietly. I sat down on the floor, my back against the bed, trying to calm my breathing. I sat like that for a long time. I didn't hear any other noises. Eventually, my body gave into exhaustion. I woke up sitting on the floor with my head resting on my knees. It was morning. Sunlight was coming through the blinds. I stood up slowly, feeling stiff all over. I walked to the window and looked outside. The dumpster area was empty again. No one there. The metal rod or pipe was gone too. I didn't know what to do. I got ready for work like a robot. My mind felt blank, but my chest was heavy with fear. That day at work, I kept thinking about what I saw. Who was that man? Why was he there in the middle of the night, scraping metal against the dumpster, just standing and staring at the building? My body felt cold every time I thought about it. I couldn't focus on anything all day. When I got home that evening, I checked the parking. I drove for nearly 6 hours before reaching the gravel road that cut through rows of tall pine trees. The sun was still high, but under the trees, it felt dim and cold. My shoulders were tense from the drive, and I could feel my lower back aching. I shifted in my seat as the tires crunched over loose gravel, the noise echoing off the trees. For a moment, I thought about turning back and finding a cheap motel closer to the highway, but I reminded myself I needed this break. I needed silence, no cell service, no noise from neighbors, no trucks rumbling past my apartment window at 3 a.m. The cabin came into view slowly. It was tucked between thick pines, an old wooden structure with moss creeping up the sides. The roof was dark with years of needles and dirt, and I could see the old metal chimney sticking out the side. The clearing around it wasn't very large, just enough space to park my car and maybe pitch a tent if someone else came with me. But I was alone. That was the whole point. I parked and stepped out. The air smelled sharp, like pine sap and old leaves. It reminded me of the camping trips I used to take as a kid. I left my bags in the car for a moment and walked around the cabin. The windows were dusty, the porch had rotting planks, and there were a few old chairs stacked in the corner. I pushed open the front door, and it swung with a heavy creak. Inside it was dim and smelled like wood and mouse droppings. I stood for a while letting my eyes adjust, feeling the stale air around me. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove, some old cupboards, and a countertop stained with rings from pots or cups left sitting too long. Against the far wall was a narrow cot with an old mattress and some folded wool blankets. I walked across the room, my footsteps thumping on the wood floor. There was a small bathroom off to the side with a compost toilet and a cracked mirror above a tiny sink. Everything felt cold to the touch. I opened the back door to look outside. The forest was thick right up to the edge of the cabin. There were broken branches and piles of dead pine needles everywhere, with no sign of a path leading further out. The trees swayed a little in the breeze, making a shushing sound that felt almost too loud in the silence. I went back to the car and grabbed my bags, hauling them inside. The sun was dropping fast, and under the trees, it felt like dusk already. I lit a few candles I found in a drawer near the kitchen and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I had brought some cans of soup and a loaf of bread. I sat down at the small wooden table and ate a sandwich, staring at the flickering candlelight. The shadows on the walls moved with each gust of wind against the cabin. It felt lonely, but it also felt clean in a way that life in town never did. That first night, I slept lightly. I woke up several times to the sound of branches rubbing against the cabin or acorns falling onto the roof. Each time I woke, my heart thumped hard, and I had to remind myself it was just the forest. At some point in the early morning, maybe around 3 a.m., I woke again to a thud. This one was heavier than an acorn. It was a solid thump against the side of the cabin. I held my breath in the dark, listening. There was no other sound. My ears strained so hard it hurt. Eventually, I heard the breeze pick up again, rustling the trees, and I told myself it must have been a branch falling. I didn't get out of my sleeping bag to check. I just lay there listening until the first dim light started showing through the small window. In the morning, I went outside to see what the noise had been. There was nothing against the cabin walls. No big branch, no rocks, nothing. I walked around the cabin twice, crunching over old needles and soft dirt, but found nothing unusual. It left a feeling in my stomach like a stone. I tried to brush it off. I made myself coffee on my camp stove and sat on the porch, staring at the trees. The breeze felt cold on my skin, but the coffee was hot, and I held the mug close to my face, breathing in the steam. Around midday, I decided to walk into the forest. I put on my boots and jacket, grabbed my small pack with water and a snack, and locked the cabin behind me. There was no trail, so I just picked a direction and went. The ground was uneven, full of fallen logs and dense ferns. I moved slowly, pushing through low branches. After about an hour, I came to a small rocky clearing with a few big boulders covered in moss. I sat down on one and drank some water. The silence out there was heavy. I could hear birds, but not many. Mostly it was just the wind brushing through the high branches and the occasional snap of twigs as small animals moved around. I sat for a long time, staring at the moss on the rocks, thinking about nothing. I tried to clear my head the way people said nature helps you do, but a part of me felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning between the trees. I couldn't shake it, even though I knew it was just me out there. After a while, I headed back. It took longer than I thought to find the cabin again. I kept walking in what I thought was the right direction, but the trees all looked the same. Finally, I saw the dark roof through the branches and felt relief wash over me. That afternoon, I gathered some kindling and bigger pieces of wood stacked under a tarp behind the cabin. I built a small fire in the stone ring off to the side of the porch. I sat there for hours, feeding it dry twigs and broken branches. The smoke smelled sweet and clean, and the fire cracked and popped as the sun set. Darkness came quick under the trees. The flames were the only light, flickering on the mossy trunks around me. I felt exposed out there, sitting by the fire with nothing but darkness beyond. After a while, I threw sand over the coals and went back inside. That night, I woke again to the same thud. It was just before dawn. I could see a faint gray light coming through the window, but it was still dark inside. The noise came again, a heavy thump against the side wall near where the cot was. My chest felt tight. I sat up, listening hard. The cabin felt silent, but my ears were ringing with blood. I forced myself to get out of the sleeping bag and walk to the window. I tried to look out into the dim forest, but the glass was fogged. I wiped it with my sleeve and pressed my forehead against it. I couldn't see anything moving. I stayed like that for a long time, just staring into the trees. When the sun rose fully, I walked around the cabin again. Nothing. No marks, no branches, no signs of animals digging or scratching. I told myself it could have been old wood shifting with the cold, but deep down it didn't feel like that. The third day was cold and overcast. I spent most of the morning chopping up some smaller logs behind the cabin to use for firewood later. My hands felt raw by the time I was done. I went inside to warm up and ate some more bread with peanut butter. Around noon, I heard a rustling noise out front. I thought maybe it was a deer. I walked to the front door and pushed it open quietly, stepping out onto the porch. There was nothing there. I walked down the steps and looked around the clearing. The forest was silent, the way it gets before it rains. I stood for a while, scanning between the trees, but saw nothing move. That afternoon, I tried to read a book I had brought, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I looked up, listening. I kept thinking I heard something out in the trees. Soft crunching sounds, like footsteps. But whenever I stood and opened the door to look, there was only stillness. The feeling of being watched kept growing in my chest, making my heart thump hard, even though I was just sitting there. I started to think coming out here alone was a mistake. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the cot with the blankets pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling in the candlelight. The shadows moved slowly as the flame flickered. I heard the wind pushing against the cabin, making it creak. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Thud. This time it was against the back wall. I held my breath, my whole body tense and frozen. Thud. It came again, heavier, closer to the window by the cot. My mouth went dry, and I felt my chest tightening like I couldn't get enough air. I sat up and stared at the window, but it was dark outside. The candles didn't reach far enough to light the glass. The thud came again, shaking the wall a little. I felt panic rising up through my throat. I grabbed the flashlight from the small table and flicked it on. The beam cut through the cabin, lighting up the rough wood walls and dusty shelves. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, and pressed my face against the cold glass. The flashlight beam barely reached past the porch, but I swung it slowly back and forth. I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. Then I heard it, a deep, rough exhale. Not like a branch falling or the wind gusting, but like someone letting out a long breath. My skin prickled all over. I tried to shine the light further out, but the battery was dimming, and it flickered. I didn't see anything move, but the sound came again, a quiet, ragged breath. My hands were shaking so hard the flashlight beam bounced wildly off the trees. I backed away from the window, feeling like something was going to burst through the glass any second. I stood in the middle of the cabin, shaking, until the first light of dawn started to filter through the windows. My knees felt weak. When it was bright enough, I went outside. The ground was covered in dew, and the air felt cold on my skin. I walked slowly around to the back wall where the thuds had come from. That's when I saw it. There were marks in the dirt. They weren't boot prints, but they were footprints. Bare feet, long, thin, with deep impressions in the soft earth. They led from the trees right up to the back wall of the cabin, then around to the side window. The toes pointed inwards, like whoever it was had been standing there, pressed against the wall. My stomach turned over. I felt like I was going to throw up. I followed the prints back towards the tree line, but they faded out into the undergrowth. I had been planning a quiet weekend away for months. Life in the city had been wearing me down. The constant noise, traffic, crowded sidewalks, and the humming tension in everyone's shoulders as they walked past each other without eye contact. I felt like I was forgetting what it meant to sit still without my phone buzzing or emails piling up. When I finally booked the old cabin up north, I told myself I wouldn't take my laptop. I wouldn't even check my phone unless it was an emergency, and I would spend the whole time reading, chopping firewood, cooking on the little gas stove, and just breathing quiet air for once. The drive up took longer than I thought because the last hour was nothing but a narrow dirt road twisting into deep pine forests. Every so often there would be a break in the trees, and I'd see empty fields or mossy boulders with thick green ferns at their base. I rolled the windows down and let the air fill the car. It smelled like pine needles and earth, and I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. The road got rougher and rougher, and I wondered if my little car would make it. At times, the bottom scraped against rocks sticking up. Eventually, I saw the wooden sign nailed to a birch tree, with faded letters that said Loon's Nest Cabin. I turned off onto an even smaller dirt track that barely looked like a road at all. The trees pressed close on either side, scratching against the mirrors. I drove slowly, avoiding roots and rocks, until I came around a bend and saw the cabin. It was small, a one-room place with a steep roof, with siding gone gray from years of sun and rain, and a stone chimney with moss growing between the rocks. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, with 2 old chairs and a small table. The grass around it was overgrown with weeds and tall grass, brushing against my shins when I stepped out. The place felt forgotten and hidden away, and I loved it immediately. Inside was simple. A single room with a small bed against one wall, covered in a faded green blanket. A small iron stove in one corner, with a neat stack of firewood beside it. A wooden counter along the back wall held a propane camping stove, a kettle, some old chipped mugs, and a few dented pots and pans. There was a small cabinet nailed to the wall with a note taped to the front that said tea, oats, sugar, salt. I opened it and saw old glass jars full of exactly that. A rusted sink with a plastic tub underneath for draining sat beside the counter. A lantern hung from a nail by the door. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell service at all. I set my backpack down on the bed and stretched my arms overhead, feeling my spine pop and loosen. The only sounds were birds in the trees outside, the breeze pushing against the roof, and the creaking of the cabin's old wood as it settled. I unpacked slowly, folding my clothes into a small, neat pile on the corner of the bed. I put my phone into my bag and zipped it up. I felt like I was cutting a cord to the outside world, and it felt good. That first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon gathering fallen branches and chopping them into smaller pieces to stack beside the stove. The repetitive swing of the axe and the thud of splitting wood cleared my mind. I boiled water on the stove for tea and sat on the porch while it grew dark, watching the trees turn from green to black as the sun went down. When it was too dark to see, I lit the lantern and read for a while, listening to the frogs and crickets outside. Eventually, I crawled under the blanket and fell asleep almost immediately. The second day, I woke up early. Pale dawn light was coming through the single window. The cabin was cold, so I pulled on a sweater and jeans and went outside to pee behind the trees. There was a faint mist between the trunks, and everything felt damp and silent. My breath came out in little clouds, and the air felt sharp and clean in my nose. I made oatmeal on the stove with some dried apples I'd brought, and ate it slowly, staring out the window at the woods. I didn't realize how hungry I was for silence until I felt it pressing all around me like a blanket. Later that morning, I decided to explore a little. Behind the cabin, a narrow trail led deeper into the woods. I grabbed a water bottle and set out, ducking under low pine branches and stepping over fallen logs covered in bright green moss. The ground was soft with old pine needles. The air smelled like wet earth and would smoke from someone far away burning a morning fire. I walked for almost an hour, following the trail as it twisted and dipped between hills. I didn't see another person, not even a boot print in the soft dirt. Just animal tracks, deer, rabbits, and what might have been a fox. Eventually, I came to a small clearing with a rotten old picnic table half sunken into the ground. Grass and weeds grew through the slats, and there were broken bottles scattered around, rusted cans, and a melted plastic jug. It looked like no one had been here in years. I sat on the edge of the table and drank some water, listening to the forest creak and shift around me. The breeze moved through the treetops with a quiet hush. After a while, I turned back towards the cabin. When I got back, it was just past noon. The sun was high and warm, so I sat on the porch for a while, eating crackers and cheese and an apple. The air buzzed with insects. Eventually, I went back inside to read, but I felt restless, like my skin was prickling with leftover city energy that hadn't bled out yet. I paced the cabin, looked through my backpack for no reason, tidied up things that didn't need tidying. That afternoon, I decided to go down to the small creek I'd passed on the drive in. I grabbed my water bottle again and walked down the dirt track until I found the narrow stream bubbling through the rocks. It wasn't deep, just ankle high in most places, but the water was so clear and cold. I sat on a rock and pulled off my boots and socks, dipping my feet in. The cold burned for a moment, and then felt good. I sat there for almost an hour, watching tiny water bugs skitter over the surface, the light flashing on their backs. I kept thinking how nice it was to not hear anything except water and birds and wind. I headed back when the shadows started to grow long. I made pasta on the stove, simple with butter and salt, and ate the whole pot while standing at the counter. As the sun set, the temperature dropped quickly, so I lit a fire in the stove. The warm glow and the smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and I felt myself relaxing again. I sat on the bed reading until I started to nod off, then blew out the lantern and crawled under the blankets. That night was when things changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was dark and silent, except for the faint creaks of cooling wood and the tiny rustles of mice in the walls. I lay there, half asleep, staring into the darkness. Then I heard it. A crunch. Slow, deliberate, like a footstep in the dry leaves outside. I froze, my eyes wide open now, straining to hear. Another crunch. Then silence. My heart started pounding. I held my breath and listened. There was nothing for a while. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon sniffing around. The trash bag with my empty food wrappers was hanging from a hook on the porch to keep it away from animals, but maybe they still smelled it. I lay there, waiting. Then I heard it again, closer to the cabin. Another crunch. Then another, but softer, like whoever or whatever it was trying to move quietly. I sat up slowly and turned to look at the window. The curtains were thin, and moonlight was shining through, making everything in the room glow faintly blue. I thought about turning on the lantern, but something in me said to stay dark. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound on the old wooden floor. I moved to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtain. At first, I didn't see anything. The trees were pale in the moonlight, black shadows stretching across the ground. Then I saw movement near the edge of the clearing, maybe 15 feet from the porch. A shape, dark and hunched over, moving slowly along the tree line. It paused, then straightened up, and I saw it was a person. I felt my throat tighten. My first thought was that it might be a hunter or someone camping nearby. But what would they be doing creeping around someone else's cabin at 2 in the morning? The person stood there, half hidden by a tree. I couldn't see any details, just a silhouette. They didn't move for a long time, just stood there, facing the cabin. I crouched down below the window, my heart beating so hard I felt it in my head. I didn't know what to do. There was no lock on the cabin door, just a wooden latch from the inside that could be lifted with a knife or even a strong finger. I thought about grabbing my phone to call for help, but then remembered there was no service here. I felt trapped. The walls were so thin I felt like I could hear every little rustle outside, every creak of branches in the breeze. After what felt like forever, I peeked through the curtain again. The person was gone. The trees were empty. I scanned the whole edge of the clearing, looking for movement, but there was nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. Silence. I crouched there for almost half an hour, barely breathing, my knees starting to ache from the cold wood. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. I lay awake until dawn, listening to every sound, jumping at every creak. But nothing else happened that night. The next morning, the world felt normal again. Birds were singing, the air smelled like pine and sun, and the breeze moved through the grass outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I walked the whole area around the cabin, looking for footprints, but the ground was covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, and if there had been any marks, they were gone now. I kept telling myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker who got lost. But in my gut, I didn't believe that. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every little noise made me jump. Squirrels in the trees, branches falling, the sound of the wind pushing against the cabin walls.